Hey guys, tonight we step back nearly 200 years to a time when survival wasn't something you watched on a reality show, it was just called Tuesday. Imagine waking up in total darkness, the smell of wood smoke clinging to everything you own, your breath visible in the frigid air, and knowing that the next 16 hours will demand every ounce of strength your body possesses. You're not camping, you're not roughing it for a weekend Instagram post. You're living on a farm in 1800s America, and honestly, you probably wouldn't survive the first week. The blisters alone would send you crying for a dermatologist who won't exist for another century. But that's what makes this story so remarkable. Millions of ordinary people did survive, and they built the foundation of a nation while doing it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing that someone in Tokyo is falling asleep while someone in Toronto is just getting cozy. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You open your eyes, and there is nothing. Not the soft glow of a phone screen, not the reassuring blink of a smoke detector, not even the ambient light pollution that modern humans have grown so accustomed to that we've forgotten what true darkness looks like. This is darkness that has weight, that presses against your eyelids, that makes you question for a disorienting moment whether you've actually opened your eyes at all. You have. You just can't tell. Somewhere in the blackness, a rooster hasn't even begun to stir. The rooster, that supposed herald of morning, is still tucked into his feathers dreaming whatever strange dreams roosters dream, but you're awake because something deep in your bones, some internal rhythm that has nothing to do with alarm clocks or smartphone notifications, has nudged you into consciousness. It's approximately 4 in the morning, though you don't know that precisely because you don't own a clock. Clocks are expensive, delicate things that belong in city parlours and church steeples, not in a one-room cabin in Ohio or Indiana or the Missouri frontier. You lie there for a moment on your straw-stuffed mattress, which rustles and crackles with every slight movement, broadcasting your wakefulness to anyone else in the cabin who might be listening. The mattress sits atop a rope bed frame, literally ropes woven back and forth to create a supportive surface, which is where the phrase "sleep tight" originates, because those ropes needed regular tightening to prevent the whole contraption from sagging into a hammock-shaped disaster. Above you, the underside of the roof is barely visible. Rough-hewn boards or perhaps just wooden shingles, with gaps that let in starlight on clear nights, and raindrops on not-so-clear ones. The air inside the cabin carries layers of scent that would overwhelm a modern nose. There's the ever-present wood smoke from the fireplace, which serves as the sole source of heat, and one of the only sources of light. There's the earthy, slightly sour smell of bodies, yours, your spouse's, your children's, because bathing is a weekly event at best, and deodorant won't be invented for decades. There's the faint mustiness of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, the sharper tang of the chamber pot in the corner that will need emptying, and underneath it all, the wholesome scent of the cabin itself, wood, mud, and the particular perfume of a home that has absorbed years of living. You swing your legs over the side of the bed, and your bare feet hit a floor that shocks you fully awake. It might be packed earth, worn smooth by countless footsteps, cold as a grave and hard as stone. Or if you're slightly more prosperous, it might be rough-sawn planks, full of splinters waiting to ambush careless toes, but at least providing some insulation from the ground below. Either way, the cold shoots up through your soles and into your spine, a physical reminder that comfort is not a priority in this life. You don't reach for a light switch. There isn't one. Instead, you navigate by memory and by feel, shuffling toward the fireplace where last night's embers might still hold a whisper of warmth. You've banked the fire carefully before bed, covering the hot coals with ash to slow their burning, preserving them through the night so you wouldn't have to start fresh in the morning. Starting a fire from scratch is tedious, time-consuming work involving flint and steel, or perhaps a friction-based method if you're out of flint, and nobody wants to do that when they're still half asleep and the temperature inside the cabin hovers somewhere around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. You kneel before the hearth, reaching for the poker to stir the ashes. There, a faint orange glow, beautiful and precious, the difference between a relatively easy morning and a frustrating one. You add kindling carefully, tiny twigs and wood shavings, blowing gently to coax the embers back to life. The flame catches, small and tentative at first, then growing, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. You add larger pieces of wood, building the fire up until it crackles and pops with satisfying authority. Now you can see, though seeing reveals only how much work awaits. The cabin is perhaps 16 feet by 20 feet, roughly the size of a modern one-car garage, and it contains your entire life. The bed where your spouse still sleeps, burrowed under a pile of quilts and blankets. The trundle bed pulled out from beneath, where several children lie tangled together for warmth like a litter of puppies. The rough wooden table and benches where meals are eaten. The spinning wheel in the corner, the rifle hung above the door, pots, pans and utensils clustered near the hearth, sacks of cornmeal and flour, a barrel of salt pork, your whole world, your every possession, visible in a single glance. Historians still argue whether farm families of this era considered themselves poor or simply normal, whether they felt deprived by their circumstances or accepted them as the natural order of things. The answer probably varies by family, by region, by individual temperament. What seems clear is that they didn't spend much time philosophizing about it. There was simply too much work to do. You pull on your clothes, which you likely slept in anyway during the colder months because changing into nightclothes and back again is an unnecessary luxury. The clothes themselves deserve a moment of appreciation, or perhaps sympathy. Wool trousers held up by suspenders, a linen or cotton shirt that has been washed so many times. It's worn nearly translucent in places, wool socks knitted by your wife or mother or grandmother, and heavy boots that you've greased with tallow to keep them somewhat waterproof. Everything is slightly stiff, slightly scratchy, slightly uncomfortable by modern standards, but everything is also durable, made to last for years, patched and mended until the patches themselves need patching. Here's a quirky detail that might surprise you. The colour of your clothes tells a story about your economic status and geographic location. Natural dyes were expensive and labour-intensive, so the very poor often wore clothing in shades of unbleached linen, a sort of dingy off-white, or the natural brown and grey of undyed wool. Butternut, a yellowish-brown dye made from walnut hulls, was popular among frontier farmers because the materials were free and abundant. Blue, particularly indigo blue, was somewhat more prestigious and would become associated with the working class only later in the century. If you saw someone wearing bright red or deep purple, you knew immediately that they had money because those dyes were imported and costly. But you're not thinking about dye chemistry right now. You're thinking about the cow. The cow needs milking. She needed milking yesterday, she needs milking today, and she will need milking tomorrow. And if you neglect this duty even once, you will regret it in ways that involve mastitis, ruined udders, and the loss of a valuable animal. Cows on 1800s farms weren't pets. They were survival. Milk meant butter, cheese, and cream. Milk meant calories for growing children. Milk meant something to trade with neighbours or sell at the market if you were lucky enough to live near one. The cow does not care that you're tired, that it's still dark outside, that the path to the barn is frozen mud that will cake on your boots and make every step treacherous. The cow has a schedule and you exist to serve it. You step outside the cabin door and the cold hits you like a physical force. In summer, this moment would be pleasant. Cool morning air, bird song, the first grey hints of dawn on the eastern horizon. In winter, this moment is an assault, the kind of cold that makes your lungs seize and your nose hairs freeze and your eyes water. You don't linger. You don't admire the stars scattered across the velvet sky, though they are magnificent, unsullied by light pollution, a glittering canopy that modern humans pay good money to travel to remote deserts to see. You put your head down and walk toward the barn. The barn is perhaps your second most important structure, after the cabin itself. Some families build the barn first and live in it temporarily while constructing the house. That's how important animal shelter is to the survival equation. Inside, the air is warmer, heated by the bodies of the animals themselves. The cow, a pig or two, maybe chickens roosting in the rafters, perhaps a horse if you're prosperous, or a pair of oxen if you're practical. The smell is powerful, hay and manure and animal musk. But it's not unpleasant to you because it represents wealth, security, food, transportation, labour. You settle onto the three-legged milking stool positioning the wooden bucket beneath the cow's udder. Your hands are cold and the cow shifts irritably at your touch. She doesn't appreciate cold hands any more than you would. You warm them for a moment against her flank, feeling the heat radiating from her massive body, and then you begin the rhythmic squeeze and pull that will fill the bucket with steaming milk. The sound is almost musical. the alternating streams hitting the bucket bottom and then the rising pool of liquid, changing pitch as the bucket fills. This is your morning. This is every morning. You will milk this cow approximately 700 times this year, and you will do it again next year, and the year after that. There is no weekend, there is no vacation, there is only the work and the seasons and the endless cycle of survival that defines farm life in 1800s America. The fire is burning steadily now back in the cabin. Your spouse is stirring, beginning her own equally demanding set of morning tasks. Your children are waking, groaning, reluctant, exactly like children in every century before and since. The day is beginning, and you're already tired. The cabin where you spend your nights, your meals, your illnesses, your arguments, your tender moments, and nearly every other aspect of your existence was not built by contractors or architects, or anyone who had ever seen a blueprint. It was built by hands, your father's hands, your neighbour's hands, using tools that would seem almost comically primitive to a modern carpenter. Axes, adzes, augers, and not much else. The structure standing around you right now represents weeks or months of exhausting labour, countless blisters, probably a few injuries, and the collaborative effort of an entire community. And yet, by modern standards, it would fail virtually every building code ever written. Let's talk about how this cabin came to be. The process begins with trees. Lots of trees. The eastern half of North America in the early 1800s is essentially one vast forest, which presents both an opportunity and an obstacle. The opportunity is obvious. Unlimited building material, free for the taking, no trip to the lumberyard required. The obstacle is equally obvious. Before you can farm the land, you have to clear it, and clearing land in an era before chainsaws is one of the most brutally demanding tasks a human being can undertake. Historians estimate that a single farmer, working alone with only an axe, could clear perhaps 1 to 2 acres of heavily wooded land per year. That's a lot of trees, but those trees, once felled, don't go to waste. You select the straightest, soundest trunks, usually between 8 and 12 inches in diameter, and you notch them at the ends so they'll lock together at the corners. There are various notching styles: saddle notches, V-notches, dovetail notches, each with advantages and disadvantages depending on your skill level and the intended permanence of the structure. A skilled axeman can notch a log in perhaps 30 minutes. An unskilled one might take considerably longer and produce a considerably sloppier result. The logs are then stacked one atop another, the notches fitting together like Lincoln logs, which, if you've ever played with those as a child, you now understand were directly inspired by this construction method. A one-room cabin might require 60 to 80 logs, depending on the length of the walls and the height you're aiming for. Each log weighs hundreds of pounds. Moving them into position requires multiple people, ropes, poles used as levers, and an intimate acquaintance with the physics of heavy objects. This is where neighbours become essential, and we'll talk more about that communal labour later. Here's the thing about log construction that isn't immediately obvious. Logs are round, and round objects don't stack neatly. There are gaps between them, significant gaps, sometimes several inches wide, and those gaps will let in wind, rain, snow, insects, and pretty much anything else that wants to get inside your home. The solution is chinking, a process of filling those gaps with whatever materials are available. The most common approach uses a combination of wooden wedges, clay or mud, dried moss, and sometimes animal hair mixed into the clay for reinforcement. Some families use a lime-based mortar if they can get it, which is more durable but more expensive. The chinking needs regular maintenance, typically annually, because it shrinks, cracks, and falls out over time. The floor beneath your feet, as we mentioned earlier, might be packed earth. Literally dirt that has been wetted, compacted, and worn smooth by use. This sounds terrible to modern sensibilities, but it's surprisingly practical. Cool in summer, easy to maintain, and when it gets dirty, you just sweep it out the door. Some families improve their dirt floors by mixing in ox blood, which as it dries creates a harder, more durable surface with a dark, polished appearance. Yes, you read that correctly. Ox blood floors. The 19th century was not for the squeamish. Puncheon floors, the step up from dirt, are made by splitting logs in half lengthwise and laying them flat side up. The resulting surface is uneven, full of splinters, and prone to developing gaps as the wood shrinks, but it's considered a significant improvement. Planed board floors represent the next tier of luxury, and the sawn lumber floors, smooth, even relatively comfortable, are the mark of genuine prosperity that most frontier families could only dream of. The roof presents its own engineering challenges. The simplest approach is the single pitch or shed roof. Boards or shingles laid across rafters that slope in only one direction, allowing rain and snow to run off one side. More common is the gable roof with two slopes meeting at a central ridge, which sheds water better and creates a larger interior space. Roofing materials vary by region and resources. Wooden shingles split from cedar, oak, or whatever's available. Sod or turf in prairie regions where timber is scarce. Thatch in areas with suitable grasses, or even bark stripped from large trees and weighted down with poles. None of these roofing methods are waterproof. Not really. They're water-resistant at best, and that resistance degrades rapidly with weather exposure. A well-maintained wooden shingle roof might last 10 to 15 years before needing replacement. A poorly maintained one might start leaking within months. Many families keep buckets positioned strategically around the cabin interior, ready to catch drips during rainstorms. An imperfect solution, but the only practical one. The fireplace is the heart of the home, both literally and figuratively. It provides heat, light, and the only means of cooking. Building a proper fireplace requires some skill, because a poorly designed one will fill your cabin with smoke, refuse to draw properly, and potentially catch fire in a catastrophic way. The firebox is typically constructed from stone if available, or from clay-covered logs if stone is scarce, an arrangement that sounds terrifyingly flammable and sometimes proves to be exactly that. The chimney rises above the roofline, built wide at the base and tapering toward the top to create proper draft, lined with clay or mortar to resist heat. A quirky historical footnote: the keeping room fireplace common in earlier colonial homes often featured an enormous hearth, sometimes 8 or 10 feet wide, with a cavernous interior where a person could literally stand upright. These massive fireplaces consumed staggering amounts of wood. Some estimates suggest 15 to 20 cords per year for a large colonial hearth, which translates to cutting, splitting, and hauling roughly 50 tons of timber annually just to keep warm. By the 1800s, fireplace design had become somewhat more efficient, with smaller openings and better draft. But heating a cabin through a harsh winter still required an almost incomprehensible amount of firewood. Speaking of which, that woodpile stacked against the cabin's exterior wall represents another kind of wealth entirely. A full woodpile heading into winter means survival. An empty or inadequate woodpile means misery at best, death at worst. Historians still argue whether more frontier deaths resulted from cold exposure during unusually harsh winters, or from the injuries sustained while frantically trying to gather wood when supplies ran low. The axe that hangs above your door isn't just a tool, it's a lifeline. Now let's step inside this cabin you call home and look around more carefully. The space seems impossibly small by modern standards. Remember, we're talking about roughly 300 square feet for an entire family, which might include 2 parents, 6 or 8 children, and possibly an elderly grandparent or 2. For comparison, the average American master bedroom today is larger than this entire dwelling. Privacy is not a concept that exists here. Everyone sleeps in the same room, often in the same bed or beds pushed together. Everyone dresses and undresses in view of everyone else. Every conversation, every argument, every intimate moment occurs within earshot of the whole family. The furniture is sparse and utilitarian. The bed frame we mentioned earlier, wooden posts connected by ropes woven in a crosshatch pattern, topped with a mattress stuffed with straw, corn husks or, if you're lucky, feathers. The mattress needs regular restuffing as its contents compress and break down. Fresh straw makes a surprising difference in sleeping comfort. Blankets and quilts pile on top, layered for warmth, each one representing hours of spinning, weaving, and stitching. A trundle bed stores beneath the main bed during the day, pulling out at night for children, sliding back to save precious floor space by morning. The table is a slab of wood on legs, simple as can be, perhaps with a smooth top if someone took the time to plane it. Benches rather than chairs are the seating of choice. Easier to build, more space efficient, and perfectly functional if somewhat uncomfortable for long sits. A chair with a back is a minor luxury. A rocking chair is practically an heirloom, often given as a wedding gift and used for decades. Storage happens on pegs and shelves and hooks. Everything hangs: clothing, tools, herbs, dried peppers, strings of onions, the rifle, the powder horn, the hunting bag. The walls of a well-established cabin bristle with useful objects, organised by frequency of use. accessible without bending or searching. A trunk or chest holds precious items, good Sunday clothes, important documents, coins if you have any, family keepsakes brought from the old home in the east or from the old country across the ocean, and everywhere, on every surface, in every corner, the evidence of fire, soot stains climbing the walls near the fireplace, the smell of smoke embedded in fabric and wood, the fine grey ash that settles on horizontal surfaces and requires constant cleaning. Your lungs, if a modern doctor could examine them, would show the effects of years breathing this air. Respiratory illnesses are common, chronic coughs nearly universal, and nobody connects these ailments to the indoor air quality, because the concept simply doesn't exist yet. This is your home. This is where you were likely born, where you might eventually die, where the entire span of your days unfolds in an endless rhythm of maintenance and survival. The cabin is cold in winter despite the fire, hot in summer because there's little ventilation, dark always because window glass is expensive, and even oiled paper lets in precious little light. But it's yours, built with your own hands, sheltering your own family, standing as proof that you've carved out a space in this vast wild continent. You might not love every aspect of it, but you know every aspect of it. You know which floorboard creaks, which corner leaks during heavy rain, which spot by the fire is warmest, which way to position yourself on the bed to avoid the sag in the ropes. This cabin and you have shaped each other, adapted to each other, become interdependent in ways that a modern person with their abstract relationship to shelter could never fully understand. And now the fire is burning steadily. The cabin is warming, and outside the window, or the oiled, paper-covered opening where a window should be, the first grey hint of dawn touches the eastern sky. The day is beginning in earnest. The smell reaches your nose before you've even fully committed to getting up from that rope-strung bed. It's cornmeal mush, again, bubbling in the iron pot that hangs from the crane over the fire. Your spouse has beaten you to the hearth this morning, stirring the thick porridge-like substance with a wooden spoon worn smooth by years of use. Breakfast in 1800s. America doesn't involve complicated decisions about avocado toast versus overnight oats. Breakfast is whatever you have, prepared however you can, and eaten as quickly as possible so you can get on with the business of not dying. Let's talk about what you're eating and why. The concept of 3 distinct meals per day, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, is still solidifying in American culture during this period, and for farm families the distinctions often blur into a continuous grazing pattern interrupted by whatever the work schedule demands. But mornings generally feature something warm and filling, designed to fuel the brutal labour ahead. That cornmeal mush, known by various regional names including hasty pudding in New England and simply mush pretty much everywhere else, represents the baseline of frontier cooking. Ground corn, water, maybe a little salt if you have it. Cook until thick. Eat. You might be wondering, doesn't that get boring? Yes, absolutely yes. Unimaginably, soul-crushingly boring. Some historians estimate that cornmeal products constituted up to 75% of the frontier diet, which means you're eating corn in some form at almost every meal, corn mush for breakfast, cornbread for lunch, corn cakes for dinner, corn pone, corn dodgers, johnny cakes, hoe cakes, different names and slight variations, but all fundamentally the same ingredient prepared slightly differently to create the illusion of variety. Here's why corn dominates so completely. It's easy to grow, produces high yields per acre, stores well when dried, grinds into flour without sophisticated equipment, and provides decent calories and nutrition. Indigenous peoples had perfected corn cultivation over thousands of years, and European settlers adopted both the crop and many preparation techniques from Native American neighbours, though they rarely credited this knowledge transfer. Corn could be planted among tree stumps in newly cleared land, tolerating partial shade that would doom wheat or barley. Corn didn't require ploughing to the same degree as other grains. Corn, in short, was the frontier's best friend. But corn alone lacks certain essential nutrients, particularly niacin in its bioavailable form, which is why frontier families who relied too heavily on corn without proper preparation sometimes developed pellagra, a nasty condition involving skin rashes, digestive problems, and eventually dementia. Native American traditions often included nixtamalization, treating corn with an alkaline solution like wood ash water or lime, which releases the niacin and makes the corn dramatically more nutritious. Many European American settlers didn't adopt this practice, to their detriment. Historians still argue whether the pellagra outbreaks documented in later southern history had their roots in these early dietary patterns established on the frontier. But your cornmeal mush isn't the whole breakfast. If you're fortunate, and fortune varies wildly depending on season, livestock health, and economic circumstances, there might be additional items on the table. Milk, fresh from this morning's milking, still warm and slightly foamy. Butter, churned a few days ago and stored in the cold cellar or spring house. Golden yellow if the cows have been eating fresh grass, pale and wan if they've been on winter hay. Eggs, if the chickens are laying scrambled in a skillet or simply boiled. And protein, the real treasure, in the form of salt pork or bacon. Let's pause on salt pork because it's going to appear in nearly every meal we discuss, and understanding it helps understand frontier life. When you slaughter a pig in late autumn, timing it for cold weather so the meat doesn't spoil during processing, you face a fundamental problem. You've just produced perhaps 200 pounds of pork and you have no refrigerator. Some of it gets smoked, becoming bacon and ham, preserved by the combination of salt curing and exposure to wood smoke. But much of it gets packed into barrels with massive quantities of salt, transforming into salt pork, intensely salty, densely fatty, shelf-stable for months or even years under the right conditions. Salt pork doesn't taste great. Let's be honest about this. By modern standards, it's overwhelmingly salty, fairly tough, and possesses a preserved quality that sits somewhere between bacon and shoe leather. But it's protein and fat, precious commodities in a world where every calorie counts, and it appears on frontier tables with monotonous regularity. You fry it to render out the fat, which becomes your cooking grease for everything else. The fried meat itself goes on the plate, chewy and dense, alongside your cornmeal mush. Here's a quirky detail. Salt pork was so central to the American diet that during the Civil War 50 years later, Union soldiers received it as a regular ration under the name sow belly, and they complained about it with the same resignation that frontier families probably felt generations earlier. Some things never change. Now, about that milk. Modern milk arrives pasteurized, homogenized, chilled, and generally safe to drink straight from the container. Your milk has experienced none of these processes. It came from the cow this morning, was strained through cloth to remove obvious debris, and now sits in a pitcher on your table, still warm, covered with a layer of cream that has already begun to rise. You drink it quickly, because unpasteurized milk spoils rapidly, especially in warm weather. Any milk not consumed fresh will be set aside for butter making, cheese making, or clabber, a deliberately soured milk product that frontier Americans ate enthusiastically, and modern Americans would probably find alarming. The safety of raw milk remains one of those topics that can still start arguments today. Suffice to say that frontier families accepted certain risks as normal that modern public health officials would find unacceptable, and occasionally those risks manifested as illness or worse. Tuberculosis, brucellosis, typhoid fever, and various other pathogens could all be transmitted through raw dairy products. But pasteurization won't be widely adopted until the late 1800s, so for now you drink what you have and trust in Providence. Eggs, when available, offer blessed variety. Scrambled, fried, boiled, or mixed into other dishes, eggs provide protein and fat in a convenient prepackaged form. The chickens that produce them are hardy creatures, able to survive on scraps and insects and whatever they can forage, giving back far more than they consume. A dozen laying hens might produce 8 or 10 eggs per day during peak season, enough to feed a family and perhaps have some left over for trading. In winter, when shorter days reduce laying frequency, eggs become precious enough to be reserved for special occasions. Breakfast beverages require some explanation, because coffee and tea, those caffeinated necessities of modern morning routines, were expensive imports available only to families with cash to spend at general store. Many frontier families drank neither, substituting various homemade alternatives that must have seemed deeply inadequate. Roasted barley or rye grain could be brewed into a vaguely coffee-like beverage. Roasted acorns, roasted dandelion roots, roasted chicory, roasted pretty much anything brown, were all tried as coffee substitutes with varying degrees of success and enthusiasm. Children and many adults simply drank milk, water, or hard cider. Yes, even for breakfast, even for children, because fermented apple cider was safer than potentially contaminated water, and was available in sufficient quantities to be almost ubiquitous. Speaking of water safety, Here's something that might surprise you. Many frontier families didn't drink plain water by choice, even when it was available, and they weren't entirely wrong to avoid it. Without modern water treatment, without understanding of germ theory, without even basic sanitation in many cases, the water from wells and streams could carry typhoid, cholera, dysentery, and a host of other waterborne illnesses. Fermented beverages, cider, small beer, even whiskey diluted with water, were often safer than raw water, and people noticed this correlation even without understanding the mechanism. So when you picture a frontier farmer drinking hard cider with his breakfast, don't judge too harshly. He's just trying not to get dysentery. The family gathers around the table now, crowded onto benches, elbows bumping, everyone reaching for food with the particular urgency of people who work hard and eat fast. Table manners, by the genteel standards of Eastern cities or European aristocracy, are somewhat relaxed out here. You eat with your fingers if no utensils are available, you talk with your mouth full, you prioritise efficiency over elegance. The meal might last 15 minutes, maybe 20 if someone has news to share or a decision to debate. Then the dishes get scraped, stacked, and added to the basin of tasks that will be addressed later, because right now there's work to do. Before you step away from the table, though, look at what's not there. Fresh fruit, unless you've dried it or preserved it in some way. Available only seasonally and briefly when trees are bearing. Fresh vegetables, same situation. The kitchen garden produces abundantly in summer and early fall, but by winter you're down to whatever you manage to preserve. Sugar, that modern omnipresence, is expensive enough that many frontier families use it only for special occasions, sweetening their everyday food with honey, maple syrup or molasses if they use sweetener at all. Wheat bread, that soft fluffy stuff from commercial bakeries, requires wheat flour, which requires either growing wheat yourself or buying it. Both challenging propositions on the frontier where corn is king. The monotony of the frontier diet is hard to overstate. Imagine eating essentially the same 3 or 4 foods, prepared essentially the same ways, for weeks and months and years on end. Imagine the excitement when something different appeared on the table. Fresh venison from a successful hunt, a basket of wild berries, a rare purchase of coffee or sugar from the store. Imagine how those small variations must have tasted like treasure, like celebration, like proof that life contained occasional pleasures amid the endless work. But right now, your stomach is full of cornmeal mush and salt pork and whatever else was available, and that fullness represents success. You've fueled your body for the morning's labours. The work awaits, demanding and relentless as always. And somewhere in your mind, you're already thinking about what you'll eat for dinner tonight. Probably cornmeal mush and salt pork, and maybe, if the garden cooperated, some beans. It's going to be a long day. The well sits approximately 40 yards from your cabin door, close enough to be practical, far enough to be inconvenient, positioned with careful attention to factors that most modern people have never had to consider. Water, that substance so easily summoned today by the twist of a faucet, represents one of the most time-consuming and physically demanding aspects of daily life on an 1800s farm. You're about to spend a significant portion of your morning collecting it, and tomorrow you'll do the same, and the day after that, and every day for the rest of your life. Let's start with how that well came to exist. Digging a well by hand is among the most dangerous and demanding tasks a farmer undertakes. You begin by selecting a spot, hopefully guided by some actual knowledge of groundwater patterns, though often guided by folklore, wishful thinking, or the advice of a water witch who claims to divine underground water sources using a forked stick. The technique, called dowsing or divining, has no scientific basis whatsoever, but it remains popular throughout the 1800s because people desperately want to believe there's a way to locate water before investing weeks of back-breaking labour in a hole that might come up dry. Once you've chosen your spot, through science, superstition or simple guesswork, you start digging. Just you, a shovel, and the earth. For the first few feet it's relatively straightforward, if exhausting. But as you go deeper, complications multiply. You need to remove the excavated dirt, which means hoisting buckets up from increasing depths. You need to shore up the walls somehow, because soil has an alarming tendency to collapse inward, burying anyone unfortunate enough to be at the bottom. You need to keep working even as the air quality deteriorates, as oxygen becomes scarce in deep holes, as the constant physical strain accumulates. Well, diggers sometimes died, crushed by cave-ins, suffocated by bad air, drowned when they hit the water table unexpectedly. The depth required varies enormously by location. In some areas, you might hit water at 10 or 15 feet, practically a gift. In others, particularly in drier regions, you might dig 40, 50, even 60 feet or more before finding reliable groundwater. Each additional foot of depth multiplies the difficulty exponentially. Historians still argue whether the physical challenge of well digging served as a meaningful barrier to Western settlement, limiting expansion into areas where groundwater lay deep beneath the surface. Once you hit water, the work isn't finished. You need to line the well with something to prevent constant erosion and collapse. Stone if available, wooden cribbing if not, later perhaps pre-made cylindrical sections of brick or concrete. You need to construct a mechanism for drawing water, a simple rope and bucket at minimum, a windlass or crank system for convenience, a sweep, a long pivoting pole with a bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other, if you're particularly clever. A well cover keeps out debris, animals and children. A well house, if you can afford the materials and labour, protects the works from weather, and provides a shaded spot where buckets can stay cool. Now it's morning, and you're standing at that well, performing the ritual you perform multiple times every day. You lower the bucket, a wooden one bound with iron hoops, or perhaps a leather one for lighter weight, listening to the rope creak through the pulley as it descends. There's a splash from the darkness below, a sound that never loses its small satisfaction, proof that the water is still there, that your well hasn't run dry. You haul the bucket back up, arm over arm, the full weight of perhaps 3 gallons of water, 25 pounds or so, pulling against your shoulders and back with each lift. 1 bucket. Maybe 5 minutes of work including the walking. 25 pounds of water. Now consider how much water your household needs. Drinking water for a family of 6 or 8 or 10. Cooking water for every meal. Water for washing dishes, washing clothes, washing bodies when bathing happens. Water for the kitchen garden, especially in dry spells. Water for the livestock. A single cow might drink 10 gallons per day, horses even more, pigs and chickens and everyone else adding to the total. In summer, when heat increases consumption and evaporation steals from every container, the water needs spike higher still. A rough estimate for a typical farm family, somewhere between 40 and 100 gallons per day, depending on season, circumstances, and how much washing is happening. Let's say 50 gallons is a reasonable average. At 3 gallons per bucket, that's 17 bucket trips to the well. At 5 minutes per trip, that's an hour and a half of pure water hauling, not counting the time to heat water, to treat water, to distribute water to where it's needed. And here's the thing, this water isn't clean by modern standards. Groundwater from a properly constructed well is relatively safe, certainly safer than surface water from streams or ponds, but it's not sterile, it hasn't been filtered, hasn't been treated with chlorine, hasn't been tested by any municipal water authority. Particles of dirt, microscopic organisms, and whatever else seeps through the soil all make their way into your drinking supply. You might notice an unpleasant taste or smell in certain seasons. You might not notice the pathogens that cause slow-developing illnesses. You drink it anyway because you have no alternative. Here's a quirky historical detail. Ice was a luxury item in the 1800s, harvested from frozen ponds in winter and stored in insulated ice houses for summer use. Wealthy urban families could purchase ice for cooling drinks and preserving food. But on a typical frontier farm, you drink your water at whatever temperature nature provides. Cool from the well in summer, dangerously cold in winter, tepid and unappetizing much of the time. The concept of a tall glass of ice water, that quintessentially American refreshment, simply doesn't exist in your daily experience. Your spouse, likely with help from older children, handles much of the water hauling while you're dealing with other morning chores. The division of labour varies by family, but water carrying often falls to women and children because men are presumed to be doing heavier work elsewhere. Though anyone who considers hauling hundreds of pounds of water daily to be light work has clearly never tried it. The wooden yoke, designed to balance buckets on either end while distributing weight across the shoulders, helps somewhat. Strong children as young as 8 or 9 might carry partial buckets. Everyone contributes because everyone has no choice. The water, once hauled, requires management. You can't simply leave 50 gallons sitting around in open buckets. In summer, it would grow stagnant and mosquito-infested. In winter, it would freeze solid. Most homes maintain several types of water storage. a barrel or large crock in the kitchen for immediate cooking and drinking use, additional containers for washing, separate supplies kept near the animals. Water intended for cooking might be filtered through cloth or sand to remove visible particles. Water for washing is used and reused, becoming progressively dirtier until someone finally throws it out and starts fresh. Now some families don't have a well. Perhaps they tried to dig one and failed, hitting rock or never finding water. Perhaps they're new to the land and haven't had time yet. Perhaps they're in a region where groundwater lies too deep to reach with hand digging. These families rely on surface water, springs, streams, rivers, ponds, which creates an entirely different set of challenges and dangers. Carrying water from a stream a quarter-mile away transforms a difficult chore into an exhausting journey. The round trip, with heavy buckets, might take 20 minutes. Do that 17 times and you've spent nearly 6 hours just on water. Obviously this is unsustainable. Families in this situation prioritise differently, using less water, washing less frequently, locating their cabins as close to water sources as possible, even if other aspects of the site are less desirable. Some dig cisterns to catch rainwater, large underground chambers lined with clay or stone, filled by runoff from the roof. Rainwater is relatively pure when it falls, though it picks up debris and bird droppings from the roof on its way to the cistern, requiring filtering and sometimes developing unpleasant qualities during storage. Historians still argue whether access to clean water or access to adequate calories constituted the more significant survival factor for frontier families. Both were essential, neither could be neglected. But water, with its daily demands, its physical weight, its absolute necessity for human life, occupied a central place in the consciousness of every farmer who had ever hauled a bucket up from a dark hole in the ground. You're thinking about water right now, in fact, as you complete another haul and pour the contents into the kitchen barrel. You're thinking about the weather, which hasn't rained in 2 weeks, which has the garden looking stressed and the animals drinking more than usual. You're thinking about the well level, which seems lower than it should be for this time of year, which makes you wonder if perhaps you'll need to dig deeper or start looking for a secondary source. Water thoughts occupy a portion of your mind that modern people reserve for Wi-Fi connectivity and phone battery levels. A background hum of concern, occasionally rising to urgency, never fully silent. The bucket descends again into the darkness. The splash echoes up. The rope bites into your calloused hands as you pull. Another day on the farm, another 100 pounds of water hauled, another small victory in the endless war against thirst. The small figure trudging beside you toward the barn isn't merely your child. She's your co-worker, your apprentice, your economic asset, and possibly your retirement plan all wrapped into one. She's 7 years old and she's been doing meaningful farm work for at least 2 years already. The notion of childhood as a protected period of play and education, insulated from adult responsibilities, simply doesn't exist out here. Children are small adults with limited experience, and they're expected to contribute to family survival from the moment they're physically capable. This isn't cruelty, this is necessity dressed in the clothing of the era. Let's examine what work looks like for children on an 1800s farm, starting with the youngest and moving up through the age ranges. A child of 4 or 5 begins with simple tasks: carrying kindling to the woodpile, gathering eggs from the henhouse, holding the yarn while mother winds it into balls, keeping the baby entertained so adults can work without interruption. These tasks require minimal skill and minimal strength, but they contribute to the household economy in measurable ways. They also begin the training process that will eventually produce competent adult farmers. By 6 or 7, tasks escalate significantly. Your daughter, walking beside you now, can milk a cow, not as quickly or as thoroughly as an adult, but competently enough that her contribution matters. She can feed the chickens, the pigs, the calf. She can draw water from the well if someone has already filled the bucket for her. She can weed the garden, distinguishing, mostly, between vegetables and unwanted plants. She can help with food preservation, shelling beans, slicing apples for drying, turning the butter churn. She can mind younger siblings with genuine responsibility, keeping them out of the fire and out of the well, and out of the 100 other dangers that surround a farm child. Your son, at 9, works alongside you in the fields during planting and harvest. He can handle an axe for smaller chopping tasks, not felling full-grown trees, but processing kindling and clearing brush. He can lead the horse or oxen while you guide the plough, a job that requires attention and consistency but not great strength. He can hunt small game, squirrels, rabbits, birds, anything that adds protein to the family table. He can fish, set snares, check the traps you've laid along the forest edge. He can ride to the neighbour's farm with a message or to the general store with a list, trusted to complete transactions and return with change. Here's a historical fact that might surprise you. The modern conception of child labour as something inherently exploitative is a remarkably recent development. Throughout most of human history, children worked as a matter of course, their labour essential to family survival in agricultural societies. The movement to restrict child labour arose during the Industrial Revolution, primarily in response to factory conditions where children worked dangerous machinery for long hours under the supervision of strangers. Farm work, familiar, supervised by parents, varied in task and season, occupied a different moral category in the minds of 1800s Americans. Whether this distinction was justified remains a question historians still argue about. The daily schedule for a farm child runs something like this: wake before dawn, complete morning chores, feeding animals, milking, hauling water, eat breakfast, complete additional chores until mid-morning, attend school if school is in session and close enough to reach, return home by mid-afternoon, complete evening chores, feeding animals again, gathering eggs, helping with supper preparation, firewood carrying, eat supper, perhaps an hour of leisure or homework by firelight, then sleep to begin the cycle again. School attendance, when it happens, is sporadic. The agricultural calendar takes absolute priority. Children are needed in the fields during planting and harvest, regardless of what the school schedule says. The school year in rural areas often runs from late fall through early spring, the dead season for farming when children can be spared. Even then, distance matters. If the nearest school is 4 miles away, through mud and snow and potential danger, many parents decide their children's education can wait for better weather or closer opportunities, or simply forever. The work is physically demanding, but perhaps more striking to modern sensibilities is the psychological weight carried by farm children. They understand from an early age that their contribution matters, that if they fail to gather the eggs, there are no eggs, that if they neglect to milk the cow suffers and the family goes without. They witness birth and death with matter-of-fact regularity. Animals are born, animals die. Sometimes babies are born, sometimes babies die. They learn to slaughter chickens by age 8 or 9, to help with the pig butchering by 10 or 11, to understand that the meat on their plate was a living creature whose neck they watched being cut. Here's a quirky detail. Many farm children had animal companions that were explicitly not pets. Your daughter might have a favourite chicken, one she named, one she talks to while collecting eggs, one she carries around the farmyard, but she also knows that someday that chicken will stop laying and will appear on the dinner table, and she will eat it without particular distress because that's simply how things work. This pragmatic relationship with animals, affectionate but fundamentally economic, shaped generations of Americans in ways that modern urban dwellers might find incomprehensible. The skills learned in childhood stay forever. By the time your children reach adulthood, they'll know how to plant, cultivate and harvest a dozen different crops. They'll know how to care for livestock, to butcher and preserve meat, to make candles and soap and cheese. The girls will know how to spin thread, weave cloth, sew garments, cook meals, preserve food, manage a household. The boys will know how to plough, build, repair, hunt, and manage the endless physical demands of farm infrastructure. They'll be, in short, fully competent adults capable of establishing their own farms and raising their own children to continue the cycle. But there's a cost to all this competence. Education beyond basic literacy remains out of reach for most farm children. Dreams and ambitions unrelated to agriculture find little space to grow. Childhood injuries are common: cuts, bruises, broken bones from falls and accidents, burns from cooking fires, worse from encounters with animals or equipment. Some children simply break under the demands, their bodies or spirits unable to sustain the endless work. The mortality rate for farm children, while lower than for infants, remains significantly higher than modern statistics, and every family knows other families who have buried children taken by accident or illness. Your daughter reaches the barn and immediately begins her tasks, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this hundreds of times before. She talks to the cow while she milks, a steady, quiet stream of conversation that seems to calm both animal and child. She works the churn with rhythmic patience. She carries the milk pails carefully, knowing that spilled milk means wasted work and disappointed parents. She's 7 years old and she's essential. You watch her work and you feel What? Pride, certainly. Pride in her competence, her reliability, her growing skills, but also something more complicated. You know her life will likely follow your own pattern. Marriage in her mid-teens, children soon after, decades of the same demanding labour that fills your days. You might wish something different for her, some easier path, some opportunity beyond the farm. But you also know that the skills you're teaching her might save her life someday. That competence is the most valuable gift you can offer. That dreaming of other possibilities is a luxury you cannot afford. The sun is fully up now, slanting golden light through the barn doors. The animals are fed, the milking is done, the morning chores are largely complete. Your daughter carries the milk toward the house, where her mother waits to begin processing it. Your son has already disappeared toward the fields, checking on something, always busy, always needed. The family machine runs on their labour as much as yours. This is simply how survival works in 1800s America. This is how it has always worked, stretching back through centuries of agricultural society. The children grow up fast, grow up capable, grow up understanding that the world offers little charity and demands much effort. Someday, they'll teach their own children the same lessons. Behind the cabin, fenced with split rails against the deer and rabbits and various other creatures who would like nothing more than to eat your future, lies the kitchen garden. This small plot of cultivated ground, perhaps a quarter acre, perhaps less, falls primarily under your wife's domain, and its success or failure can mean the difference between adequate nutrition and slow starvation. The kitchen garden doesn't get the same attention in historical accounts as the broad fields where corn and wheat grow, but in many ways it matters more. Let's step into that garden and see what's growing. The layout follows practical wisdom refined over generations. Closest to the house, the herbs: sage, thyme, rosemary, mint, parsley, chamomile, and a dozen others clustered near the kitchen door where they can be harvested quickly during cooking. Herbs serve multiple purposes: flavouring food that would otherwise be monotonous, providing folk remedies for various ailments, repelling insects, and sometimes simply smelling pleasant in a world that often smells decidedly unpleasant. Your wife knows each plant intimately, knows when to harvest, how to dry, which combinations treat which symptoms. Beyond the herbs, the vegetables spread in rough rows. Beans climb poles or sprawl across the ground depending on variety. Kidney beans, lima beans, snap beans, dried beans for winter storage. Squash runs riot in the spaces between other plants, its broad leaves shading out weeds while its fruit swells toward autumn harvest. Butternut, acorn, pumpkins, gourds. Cabbage heads emerge slowly from rosettes of outer leaves, destined for sauerkraut or coleslaw or simple boiled accompaniment. Onions, carrots, turnips, beets push their roots down into the dark soil, their above-ground portions giving little hint of the treasure below. The tomato deserves special mention, because its story captures something about the evolving nature of American foodways. In the early 1800s, many Americans still regarded tomatoes with suspicion. They belonged to the nightshade family after all, and various folklore traditions warned that they were poisonous, or at least unwholesome. Historians still argue exactly when and how tomatoes transitioned from curiosity to staple, but by mid-century they were becoming common in kitchen gardens, eaten fresh in season and preserved as sauces and ketchups for winter use. If your garden includes tomatoes in 1840, you're somewhat progressive. If it includes them in 1800, you're practically radical. Here's a quirky detail. The concept of a salad, as we understand it, barely exists in frontier cooking. Raw vegetables, when eaten at all, are typically consumed individually rather than mixed together with dressing. Lettuce, when grown, might be wilted with hot bacon grease rather than served crisp and cold. The elaborate salad bars of modern grocery stores would seem not just impractical, but vaguely suspicious to an 1800s farm wife. All those raw vegetables, uncooked, possibly unwashed, sitting out where anyone could touch them. The corn in your kitchen garden differs from the corn in your main fields. Here you're growing sweet corn for fresh eating, a luxury crop, something to be enjoyed at peak ripeness during a brief summer window. The field corn is starchier, tougher, grown primarily for drying and grinding into meal. The distinction between sweet corn and field corn is meaningful, and mixing up your seed can result in disappointing results in either context. Potatoes occupy a complicated position in the American agricultural landscape. Irish and German immigrants brought potato growing traditions with them, and the crop produces abundantly with relatively little effort. But potatoes also carry associations with poverty. The Irish potato famine of the 1840s looms large in cultural memory, and some American farmers regard them with mild disdain. Still, potatoes store well, provide solid nutrition, and offer variety from the endless corn. Many kitchen gardens include at least a few potato hills. Now let's talk about the work involved in maintaining this garden, because it's far more demanding than modern vegetable gardening. Your wife begins in early spring, as soon as the ground can be worked, breaking soil that has compacted over winter. Without a rototiller, without any powered equipment whatsoever, this means hours of labour with a spade or mattock, turning over each section by hand. She might have your help for the initial breaking, or she might handle it alone while you're occupied with field preparation. Either way, the work is back-breaking and seems to take forever. Soil amendment follows the breaking. Animal manure from the barn, aged, ideally because fresh manure can burn plants, gets forked in to add fertility. Wood ash from the fireplace contributes minerals and adjusts soil pH. Compost, if your wife maintains a pile of decomposing plant material, provides additional organic matter. The scientific understanding of soil chemistry lies in the future, but generations of practical experience have taught farmers that gardens grow better with these additions. Planting happens according to frost dates that vary by region, but are memorised and debated with the intensity modern people reserve for sports statistics. Plant too early, and a late frost kills your seedlings. Plant too late, and crops don't mature before autumn's cold arrives. The timing of each vegetable differs. Peas go in early, tolerating cold. Beans and squash wait for warmer soil. Successive plantings of lettuce and radishes provide ongoing harvest. Your wife keeps all this in her head, adjusting year by year based on observed results and exchanged wisdom. Then comes weeding. Endless, eternal, soul-crushing weeding. Without herbicides, without plastic mulch, without any of the modern weed suppression techniques, the garden produces unwanted plants almost as enthusiastically as wanted ones. A neglected garden disappears under weeds within weeks, the vegetables choked out, the season's work wasted. Your wife weeds every day, or nearly every day, during the growing season, an hour here, 2 hours there, constantly battling the persistent green invaders. Watering adds another labour demand during dry spells. Remember those buckets hauled from the well. Some of them go to the garden, carried row by row, poured carefully at the base of thirsty plants. A quarter-acre garden might need 100 gallons to get through a hot week without rain. That's 30-plus bucket trips on top of all the household water needs. During drought years, the garden suffers because there simply isn't enough water to go around, and tough choices must be made about which plants live and which die. Pest control in the 1800s involves observation, physical removal, and folk remedies of questionable effectiveness. Your wife might walk the garden each morning, picking caterpillars and beetles by hand, dropping them into a bucket of soapy water. She might plant certain herbs near vulnerable vegetables based on beliefs about companion planting and pest repellency. She might spray plants with concoctions of pepper water, tobacco juice, or other homemade pesticides. Some of these techniques work somewhat, others do almost nothing. Sorting reliable methods from wishful thinking is largely a matter of trial and error. The harvest, when it finally arrives, brings both abundance and urgency. Vegetables ripen on their own schedule, not yours, and produce that isn't picked at the right time goes to waste. Your wife works frantically through late summer and early autumn, harvesting each crop as it matures, immediately processing it for preservation before spoilage sets in. Fresh beans become dried beans or pickled beans. Squash and pumpkins go to the root cellar. Cabbage transforms into sauerkraut. Herbs are cut and hung to dry. The kitchen becomes a preservation factory, and the work extends from dawn to well past dark. Historians still argue about the relative caloric contribution of kitchen gardens versus field crops to frontier family diets. By pure calories, the corn and wheat fields probably contributed more. But by nutrition, variety and quality of life, the kitchen garden mattered enormously. The vegetables grown there provided vitamins and minerals that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases. The variety prevented the psychological damage of eating nothing but cornmeal mush for months on end. The garden's success represented feminine competence and household management skill, a source of pride in a world that offered women few opportunities for public achievement. Your wife stands in her garden now, surveying the rows with an expert eye. She notes which plants are thriving, which struggling, which areas need water, which show signs of pest damage. This small plot of ground represents her particular contribution to family survival, her expertise, her responsibility. She talks to the plants sometimes, or talks to herself while working among them, finding in the garden a space that belongs to her in a way that little else does. The beans are nearly ready, the squash is coming along, the tomatoes, if you're growing them, are just starting to blush with colour. The harvest will be good this year. If the weather holds, if the pests stay manageable, if nothing unexpected goes wrong, the garden grows, the family survives, the cycle continues. The pig eyes you with what seems like suspicion as you approach with the slop bucket, but that's just how pigs look, eternally sceptical, perpetually convinced that you're up to something. This pig, along with its companions in the pen, represents one of the most important investments your farm makes each year. Livestock aren't pets out here. They're survival, economy, labour, and food supply all wrapped in hide and feathers. Understanding how frontier families manage their animals helps explain how anyone survived at all. Let's start with that pig, since you're already standing here. Pigs are miraculous creatures from a farming efficiency standpoint. They eat almost anything: kitchen scraps, garden waste, spoiled grain, roots, nuts, small animals, literally whatever they can fit in their mouths. And they convert that diverse diet into protein and fat with remarkable efficiency. A pig purchased or farrowed in spring can weigh 200 pounds or more by autumn, ready for slaughter when cold weather arrives. The meat preserves well through smoking and salting. The fat renders into lard for cooking and soap making. Even the intestines and bladder find uses in an economy that wastes nothing. Pigs also require relatively little infrastructure. Your pig pen is a rough enclosure of wooden rails, strong enough to contain animals that are more powerful and intelligent than they appear. Pigs don't need elaborate housing. A simple shelter to protect from extreme weather suffices. They don't need pasture in the traditional sense. They can forage in woods and waste areas, rooting for acorns and grubs and whatever else the earth provides. In many frontier communities, pigs roam semi-freely through forests, identified by distinctive ear notches, returning periodically to farmyards for supplemental feeding. Here's a quirky historical detail. The famous Cincinnati pork packing industry of the mid-1800s earned that city the nickname Porkopolis, and the systematic processing of hogs there helped transform pork from subsistence food into commercial commodity. But on your frontier farm, you're not thinking about markets and commerce. You're thinking about the 200 pounds of meat that pig represents, the lard for next year's cooking, the hams and bacon that will hang in your smokehouse through winter. The cow stands in her stall, chewing her cud with the meditative patience that characterises her species. You've already milked her this morning. Remember that pre-dawn trip to the barn, and now you're checking that she has water, that her hay supply is adequate, that nothing seems amiss with her health. A cow represents a significant investment, perhaps $40 to $60 in an era when a labourer might earn $1 a day, and losing one to illness or accident is a genuine financial disaster. Cows provide milk, obviously, which becomes butter, cheese, cream, and direct nutrition for your family. But they also provide calves, one per year if breeding goes well, which can be raised for meat or sold for cash or kept to expand your herd. And at the end of their productive lives, cows provide beef and leather. The economics of cow keeping require careful calculation. The cost of winter feed, the labour of daily milking, the risk of disease, balanced against the steady stream of dairy products and eventual offspring. Your cow isn't a specialised dairy breed in the modern sense. Specialised breeding for milk production intensifies later in the 1800s and into the 1900s. For now, you likely have something descended from English cattle breeds. A general-purpose animal that produces modest amounts of milk, provides reasonable meat, and can even serve as a draft animal in a pinch. The enormous udders and bony frames of modern Holsteins would seem bizarre to you. Your cow looks more compact, more balanced, less like a milk-producing machine and more like, well, a regular cow. Chickens occupy the lowest rung of livestock prestige but contribute enormously to daily life. Your flock, perhaps a dozen hens and a rooster, provides eggs almost daily during laying season, meat when birds age out of production, feathers for pillows and mattresses, and a useful way to dispose of kitchen scraps and insect pests. Chickens practically feed themselves during warm months, scratching through the farmyard and surrounding areas for seeds, bugs, and whatever else they can find. In winter they need supplemental grain, but their demands remain modest compared to larger animals. The chicken coop is a simple structure. Wooden walls, a dirt floor, nesting boxes along one side where hens lay their eggs, roosting poles where the flock sleeps at night. Your main challenge with chickens isn't feeding them or housing them, it's protecting them from the endless parade of predators that view chickens as convenient meals. Foxes, hawks, raccoons, weasels, snakes and wandering dogs all take their toll on frontier flocks. You've lost birds to predators before and you'll lose more. It's simply the cost of chicken keeping in a world where predator control is imperfect. Historians still argue about the relative economic importance of different livestock species on frontier farms. Pigs provided the most meat per unit of investment. Cows provided steady dairy products and valuable offspring. Chickens provided daily protein through eggs. The optimal mix varied by region, climate, available feed, and family preference, but most farms maintained some version of all three. Let's talk about the horse in the paddock, assuming you have one, which isn't guaranteed. Horses are expensive, both to purchase initially and to maintain throughout their lives. A decent workhorse might cost $80 to $100, more than a cow, more than half a year's wages for a labourer. Horses eat prodigious amounts of food, particularly expensive grain rather than the grass and hay that satisfy cattle. Horses require more veterinary attention, more careful handling, more specialised equipment in the form of harnesses and saddles and shoes. So why do farmers keep horses? Transportation, primarily. Your horse carries you to the general store, to church, to the homes of distant neighbours. Your horse pulls the wagon that brings crops to market and purchases back from town. In regions with developed roads, horses provide speed and convenience that walking simply cannot match. Some farmers use horses for field work, ploughing and harrowing and such, though many frontier families prefer oxen for these tasks. Oxen deserve their own moment of appreciation. These castrated male cattle are slower than horses but stronger for their upkeep cost, more patient, more forgiving of inexperienced handling. Oxen eat hay and grass rather than expensive grain. Oxen can work rough, stumpy, newly cleared ground that would injure or frustrate a horse. When they eventually wear out or are no longer needed, oxen can be eaten, a practical consideration that doesn't apply to horses. Many frontier farms are built on oxen power, and the gradual transition to horses represents increasing prosperity and infrastructure development as much as any aesthetic preference. Your sheep, if you keep sheep, present their own challenges and rewards. Sheep provide wool for spinning and weaving, meat when slaughtered, and modest milk if you care to pursue sheep dairying. They also require substantial pasture, protection from predators, annual shearing, and regular attention to the foot problems and parasites that plague their species. Sheep make sense in regions with abundant grazing land and established textile traditions. They make less sense on heavily wooded frontier farms, where pasture is scarce and fabric can be purchased from the general store. The morning feeding rounds take you from animal to animal, assessing health, distributing food, checking water supplies, examining fencing for damage. You've learned to read livestock the way some people read books, noticing the subtle signs of illness, stress, injury, or contentment that distinguish healthy animals from troubled ones. A cow that doesn't finish her hay, a pig that seems listless, a chicken with drooping feathers. These observations demand attention because untreated problems escalate quickly in an era before antibiotics and modern veterinary medicine. Here's a quirky detail. Many farmers talk to their animals not just casually but constantly, maintaining running conversations through daily chores. Some believed, and some research today suggests they weren't entirely wrong, that animals responded to familiar voices, remaining calmer and more cooperative when addressed in soothing tones. The pragmatic farmer discovered that a cow milked with gentle talking produced more milk than one handled roughly and silently. The relationship between farmer and livestock, while ultimately economic, often contained genuine elements of affection and familiarity. Your animals are fed now, watered, checked, and temporarily released from your immediate attention. The rest of the day will bring other demands, but you'll return this evening to repeat the process. Feeding, watering, milking again, closing coops against predators, bedding down animals for the night. The rhythm never stops, 7 days a week, every week of the year. The animals depend on you entirely, and you depend on them just as completely. This mutual dependence defines farm life, creates its structure, gives purpose to its endless routines. The pig watches you leave with the same suspicious expression it wore when you arrived. Some things never change. Your hands grip the plough handles worn smooth by generations of use as you guide the metal blade through soil that resists every inch of progress. Ahead of you, an ox, patient, powerful, seemingly indifferent to your struggles, provides the pulling force that makes this work possible but not easy. Behind you stretches a single furrow, dark earth turned to the sky, and ahead lies the rest of the field, waiting. This is planting season, and corn is going in the ground. Let's understand why corn dominates your agricultural life so completely. Corn, or maize, as botanists call it, arrived in North America via a remarkable journey from its origins in ancient Mexico, where indigenous peoples domesticated it from a wild grass called teosinte over thousands of years of careful selection. By the time European colonists arrived, corn cultivation had spread throughout the continent, with countless varieties adapted to different climates, growing seasons and uses. Native Americans taught struggling colonists how to plant corn, how to tend it, how to prepare it for eating, essentially saving early settlements from starvation. The debt that American agriculture owes to indigenous corn knowledge cannot be overstated, though it frequently goes unacknowledged. You plant corn because it works. Consider the alternatives. Wheat requires better soil preparation, careful seeding at proper depth, and relatively clean fields. Difficult conditions to achieve on newly cleared frontier land full of roots and stumps. Oats and barley have similar requirements. Rice needs standing water. European crops expect European conditions, and the rough frontier offers something quite different. But corn tolerates chaos. You can plant corn among stumps, in partially cleared land, using techniques that would doom other grains. Corn grows tall enough to compete with weeds. Corn produces abundantly, perhaps 20 to 40 bushels per acre depending on conditions, providing enough calories to sustain families through long winters. The planting method you're using now reflects these practical realities. Rather than the neat mechanized rows of modern agriculture, you're creating hills, mounds of soil about 4 feet apart in each direction, into which you'll plant several corn seeds along with beans and squash. This Three Sisters technique, borrowed directly from Native American practice, creates a mutually beneficial planting system. Corn stalks provide support for climbing bean vines, beans fix nitrogen in the soil that feeds the corn, and squash leaves shade the ground to suppress weeds and retain moisture. It's an elegant solution refined over centuries, and you'd be a fool not to use it. Here's a historical fact that might surprise you. The hybrid corn varieties that dominate modern agriculture didn't exist until the 20th century. Your corn is an open-pollinated variety, meaning it reproduces naturally, and you can save seed from this year's harvest to plant next year. The seeds your family has been planting may represent generations of selection. Your grandmother saving kernels from the best ears, your father continuing the tradition, the variety slowly adapting to your particular farm's conditions. This genetic heritage has real value, and losing it to a failed harvest or careless storage represents a genuine setback. The plough you're guiding is a remarkably simple tool, essentially a blade attached to handles and a frame designed to cut into soil and turn it over. The moldboard plough, with its curved metal surface that lifts and inverts the soil, represents a significant improvement over earlier scratch ploughs that merely disturbed the ground surface. You might be using a cast iron plough, which holds an edge better than wrought iron, but is heavier and more prone to cracking. Later in the century, steel ploughs will transform prairie farming by slicing through tough grassland soil that defeats iron implements, but that innovation hasn't reached your farm yet, or hasn't become affordable. Now let's talk about the actual physical experience of ploughing, because it's far more demanding than it looks. Your ox walks forward at perhaps 2 miles per hour, a slow, steady pace that it can maintain for hours. Your job is to keep the plough blade at proper depth, neither too shallow, which fails to adequately prepare the soil, nor too deep, which exhausts the animal and accomplishes nothing extra. You must maintain a straight line, following the previous furrow, adjusting constantly for roots, rocks, and uneven terrain. You must watch for hazards. A hidden stump that could snap the plough blade, a rock that could send the handles slamming into your ribs. You do all this while walking, endlessly walking, over rough ground, steering a heavy implement, mile after mile. A strong team and experienced ploughman might complete an acre per day under good conditions. Your field might be 10 acres, 20, depending on your ambitions and labour force. That's weeks of ploughing before you can even begin planting. And ploughing is only one of several soil preparation steps. Harrowing, dragging a heavy frame across the ploughed ground to break up clods. Potentially multiple passes, all before the first seed touches the earth. Historians still argue about the productivity of frontier farms compared to established Eastern agriculture or European methods. The frontier farmer typically produced less per acre than his counterparts elsewhere. Rougher techniques, poorer equipment, less refined seeds. But he also worked more acres with less labour, making up in quantity what he sacrificed in quality. The economic calculus of American farming favoured expansion over intensification, at least until the frontier closed and farmers had to extract more from fixed land areas. The planting itself happens in the days following ploughing and harrowing. You work along the rows of prepared hills, pushing seeds into the loose soil with your fingers, covering them over, moving to the next hill. If you're following the Three Sisters method, you plant corn first, then beans a few weeks later when corn stalks are tall enough to climb, then squash shortly after. If you're planting corn alone, you might space hills closer together or plant in continuous rows rather than separated mounds. Here's a quirky detail. Many farmers planted by the moon, believing that lunar phases affected plant growth. Crops that produced above ground, corn, beans, squash, were planted during the waxing moon, when lunar light was increasing. Root crops went in during the waning moon. Whether this practice had any actual effect remains disputed, but it was widespread enough to appear in almanacs and agricultural guides throughout the 1800s. Your grandmother probably planted by the moon, and you might too, because sometimes tradition and superstition become indistinguishable from wisdom. Once planted, the corn requires ongoing attention throughout the growing season. Cultivation, working the soil between rows to destroy weeds and aerate the earth, happens multiple times as plants mature. You might use a hoe for this, walking endless rows with rhythmic chopping motions, or you might use a small cultivating plough drawn by horse or ox. Either way, the work demands hours upon hours of labour under the summer sun, with breaks only for water and the occasional rest in shade. The corn grows, knee-high by the 4th of July, according to the old saying, though actual growth rates vary by variety and conditions. Tassels emerge at the top of stalks, releasing pollen that drifts down to fertilise the silks emerging from developing ears. The transformation from seed to mature plant happens with visible speed during summer's long days. You can almost watch the corn growing if you pay attention, adding inches overnight during peak development. Hazards threaten at every stage. Drought stunts growth and reduces yields. Excessive rain promotes disease and can flatten mature plants. Windstorms can do the same. Crows and other birds eat newly planted seeds. You might station a child in the field during planting season to scare them away. Insects attack leaves, roots, and developing ears. Larger animals, deer, raccoons, wild pigs, view your corn as a convenient buffet. Some farmers sleep in their fields as harvest approaches, guarding against raiders both animal and occasionally human. The harvest, when it finally arrives in early autumn, brings its own demands. You walk the rows, pulling ears from stalks, tossing them into baskets or wagons, processing the entire field in a burst of intensive labour. The ears then need husking, removing the outer leaves, drying, shelling, removing kernels from cobs, and storage. Some corn stays whole for winter, feeding to livestock. Some gets ground immediately into meal. Some waits in dry storage for gradual processing through the cold months ahead. Your hands are calloused beyond recognition now, the skin thickened into protective armour by months of gripping tools. Your back has adapted to the constant bending, though it still aches after long days. Your relationship with this particular field, this particular crop, has become intimate. You know every slope, every wet spot, every corner where weeds proliferate despite your best efforts. The corn will feed you through winter, or most of it. The corn will feed your animals. The corn, if you have surplus, might be sold or traded for things you cannot grow or make yourself. The cycle continues. Next spring, you'll plough this field again, or a different field in your rotation, and plant corn again, and tend it again, and harvest it again. The rhythm never stops. Not everything on your farm exists purely for survival. Some crops represent aspiration, the hope of actual cash income, of economic advancement, of participation in the broader market economy that exists somewhere beyond your isolated homestead. Wheat, oats, and a few other crops carry this commercial potential, and understanding them helps explain why frontier farmers rarely became wealthy, despite their unrelenting labour. Let's start with wheat, the prestige grain. Wheat flour makes the lightest, most desirable bread, the kind of bread that wealthy people eat, the kind that reminds European immigrants of home, the kind that commands premium prices in town markets. If corn is survival food, wheat is aspiration food. Growing wheat successfully could lift your family into modest prosperity, providing actual currency rather than just calories. This potential explains why farmers keep trying to grow wheat even when conditions make success difficult. The problem is that wheat demands more than corn. Wheat needs relatively clean, well-prepared fields, not the stumpy, root-filled ground of newly cleared frontier land. Wheat requires careful seeding at proper depth and spacing. Wheat is more susceptible to disease, insects and weather damage than hardy corn. Wheat benefits from fertile soil and good drainage, conditions not always present on randomly selected frontier farms. Many families plant wheat with high hopes and harvest disappointment when yields fall far short of expectations. Here's a historical fact. The opening of the Erie Canal in 1825 transformed Eastern American agriculture by connecting Great Lakes farmers to Atlantic markets. Suddenly, wheat grown in Ohio or Indiana could reach New York City at reasonable cost, allowing Midwestern farmers to compete directly with Eastern production. This market access encouraged more wheat cultivation on the frontier, but it also introduced competitive pressures that squeezed profit margins. Historians still argue whether canal and later railroad connections ultimately helped or hurt small farmers by integrating them into volatile commodity markets. Your wheat field, if you have one, occupies perhaps 5 or 10 acres, smaller than your corn acreage, reflecting wheat's greater risk and difficulty. You plant in autumn for winter wheat varieties, which lie dormant under snow and resume growth in spring, or in early spring for spring wheat varieties that complete their entire life cycle before autumn. The choice depends on your climate, your available seed, and local traditions that may or may not reflect optimal practice. Harvesting wheat requires different tools and techniques than harvesting corn. The grain must be cut when ripe but not overripe, as shattered grain falls to the ground and is lost. You use a scythe or cradle, a scythe with added wooden fingers that catch cut stalks and lay them in neat bundles, swinging in rhythmic arcs, moving through the field with deceptive slowness while actually covering significant ground. The cut wheat gets gathered into shocks, dried in the field, then transported to threshing. Threshing separates grain from straw, and it represents one of the most labour-intensive steps in the entire process. Traditional threshing involves beating dried wheat with flails, hinged wooden implements that crack against the grain, knocking kernels loose from their heads. This work is dusty, monotonous, and seemingly endless. A single farmer might spend entire winter months threshing the previous autumn's harvest. Some farms use animal-powered threshing, spreading wheat on a hard surface and driving horses or oxen over it repeatedly, which is faster but requires appropriate facilities and cooperation from animals. Here's a quirky detail. Threshing bees, where neighbours gathered to help each other process grain in communal work parties, often became significant social occasions. The hard work was followed by substantial meals, music, and socializing, a welcome break from the isolation of farm life. These gatherings served economic functions, getting work done efficiently, and social functions, maintaining community bonds, sometimes matchmaking young people simultaneously. After threshing comes winnowing, separating the grain kernels from the chaff and broken straw that remain mixed together. You accomplish this by tossing the material into the air on a breezy day. The lighter chaff blows away while heavier grain falls back to the ground. It's simple physics, but it requires repetition, patience, and favourable weather conditions. Mechanical winnowing devices exist but remain expensive and uncommon on small frontier farms. Finally, the wheat goes to the mill for grinding into flour, unless you have your own grist mill, which you almost certainly don't. Because mills require substantial capital investment in specialised equipment and water power or wind power to operate. The miller takes a portion of your grain as payment, typically 1/8 to 1/4, depending on local custom and competition. You take home flour that will transform into biscuits, bread, pie crust, and other treats that distinguish your table from pure corn eaters. Oats serve a different purpose, primarily as animal feed, but also as human food in the form of oatmeal and oat cakes. Horses particularly benefit from oats, which provide concentrated energy for working animals. If you keep horses rather than oxen for your heavy work, a portion of your acreage goes to oats essentially to feed your workers. Oats also tolerate poorer soils and cooler climates than wheat, making them a safer crop in marginal conditions. Rye and barley appear on some farms, though less commonly than corn, wheat and oats. Rye flour makes a dense, strongly flavoured bread that some immigrants prefer based on European traditions. Barley primarily becomes animal feed, though it can also be malted for beer production, a cottage industry that some farm wives pursue to generate additional household income. The variety of grains cultivated varies significantly by region, ethnicity, and individual circumstance. Now let's address the complicated question of money, because it's essential to understanding why farmers work so hard and achieve so little apparent prosperity. Most frontier farmers operate in a mixed economy where cash is genuinely scarce. They produce much of what they need directly: food, shelter, basic clothing, without money ever changing hands. They trade with neighbours, your surplus butter for their surplus wool, say, without formal currency. They maintain running accounts at the general store, bringing eggs or grain or other produce, and receiving credit toward purchases, sometimes never settling in cash at all. When actual money does appear, it tends to flow outward rather than inward. Taxes require cash, land payments require cash, manufactured goods that cannot be produced locally, metal tools, window glass, coffee, sugar, require cash. Many frontier families see perhaps $50 to $100 in actual currency over an entire year, and most of that goes immediately to essential purchases and debts. The dream of producing cash crops, wheat, tobacco, cotton in southern regions, represents the dream of economic advancement, of accumulating enough surplus to buy more land, better equipment, finer goods. Some families achieve this dream and build substantial prosperity over generations, but many others find that commodity prices fluctuate unpredictably, that transportation costs eat up profits, that one bad year erases the gains of several good ones, and that the commercial economy offers risks as well as opportunities. Historians still argue about whether frontier farmers were capitalists seeking profit maximization or peasants seeking self-sufficiency, with surplus sale as an afterthought. The answer probably varies by family, by generation, by region, and perhaps by individual personality. What seems clear is that most frontier families pursued multiple strategies simultaneously, growing survival crops for their own consumption, while also producing what commercial crops they could manage, hedging their bets against uncertainty. Your wheat field stands growing now, if you've planted one, representing both hope and risk. The harvest might bring cash that allows you to purchase a new plough, or fabric for clothes, or perhaps pay off the remaining balance on your land. Or the harvest might disappoint, lost to weather or disease or poor yields, leaving you no better off than before despite all the extra labour invested. The market economy beckons, promising opportunity. But from where you stand, behind your plough in your cornfield, the market remains distant, uncertain, and perhaps less trustworthy than the land itself. The flintlock rifle hangs above your cabin door and you lift it down now with the care it deserves. This weapon represents both a significant investment, perhaps $8 to $15 for a decent long rifle, and a lifeline when other food sources fail. Today you're heading into the woods, not for recreation, but for nutrition, to supplement your diet with wild protein that costs nothing but time and luck. Let's venture into the forest together. The woodlands surrounding your farm teem with game, or at least they did when you first arrived. Deer move through the undergrowth in early morning and evening, following trails worn by generations of travel. Turkeys scratch and gobble in clearings. Squirrels chatter from tree branches, oblivious to the danger you represent. Rabbits freeze at your approach, hoping their stillness renders them invisible. The forest provides, if you have the skill to accept its offerings. Your rifle is a muzzle-loading weapon, meaning you load it from the front rather than using cartridges that insert at the rear. The loading process is sequential and cannot be rushed. Pour measured black powder down the barrel, place a greased cloth patch over the muzzle, set a lead ball on the patch, push ball and patch down the barrel with your ramrod until seated firmly against the powder charge. Half-cock the hammer, prime the pan with fine powder, close the frizzen, and finally you're ready to fire. An experienced shooter can complete this process in perhaps 30 seconds. An inexperienced one takes considerably longer. Either way, you get one shot before repeating the entire sequence. Here's a historical fact that shapes your hunting approach. One shot means that accuracy matters far more than rate of fire. Frontier hunters developed remarkable marksmanship partly out of necessity. Ammunition and supplies were expensive and often scarce, so wasting shots was economically painful. The legendary accuracy of American riflemen, which proved advantageous during the Revolutionary War, grew from this practical hunting tradition rather than from formal military training. You move through the forest now with deliberate quietness, each footstep placed carefully to avoid snapping twigs or rustling dry leaves. Your eyes scan constantly, looking for movement, for shapes that seem wrong, for the flicker of a white tail or the outline of antlers against the foliage. Your ears strain for sounds, a twig breaking in the distance, a disturbance in the bird chatter, the grunt of a deer, or the drumming of a grouse. Hunting requires this total sensory engagement, this becoming part of the forest rather than intruding upon it. Deer provide the most meat per successful hunt, making them the preferred target for families seeking to fill their larders. A good-sized buck might yield 80 to 100 pounds of usable meat, protein that would otherwise require purchasing expensive livestock or doing without. Deer hunting involves patience, knowledge of deer behaviour and movement patterns, and often considerable luck. You might sit in a likely location for hours, waiting for a deer to wander into range. You might stalk slowly through areas where you know deer bed down, hoping to catch one unaware. Either way, success is far from guaranteed. Here's a quirky detail. Deer drives, where groups of hunters work together to push deer toward waiting shooters, were common community hunting practices. These cooperative hunts could yield multiple deer in a single day, with meat shared among participants according to various traditional arrangements. The social aspect of hunting reinforced community bonds in much the same way that barn raisings and threshing bees did. Smaller game offers more reliable success, if less reward per animal. Squirrels are practically ubiquitous in eastern forests, and a hunter who waits quietly beneath a nut-producing tree can often bag several in an afternoon. Squirrel meat is lean, somewhat tough, and distinctly flavoured. Not a modern delicacy, but perfectly nutritious and available when larger game proves elusive. Rabbits provide more meat per animal, though they're also warier and harder to approach within rifle range. Turkey hunting requires particular patience and skill. Wild turkeys are larger than their domesticated descendants and considerably wilder. They can fly, run fast, see exceptionally well, and tend toward extreme caution. Calling turkeys, making sounds that imitate hen calls, can draw gobblers within range, but it can also spook them if done poorly. A turkey kill represents both achievement and significant nutrition, with birds sometimes weighing 20 pounds or more. Trapping and snaring supplement rifle hunting, providing protein through different methods that don't require ammunition. Simple snares, loops of cord or wire positioned along known game trails, can capture rabbits and other small animals without human presence. More elaborate traps target larger animals, deadfalls that crush, pit traps that contain, water sets that drown. Trappers can set many traps and check them periodically, converting time into protein without the concentration that active hunting demands. The fur trade adds economic dimension to hunting and trapping activities. Beaver pelts, fox skins, raccoon furs and other animal products command market prices that can convert wilderness resources into cash. Some frontier families supplement farming income with winter trapping, working the woods during the agricultural off-season when crops don't demand attention. The fur trade's economic importance declines through the 1800s as animal populations decrease and fashion preferences shift, but it remains a meaningful income source for families with appropriate skills and market access. Fishing provides another wild protein source, though its availability depends on proximity to suitable waters. Streams, rivers and lakes yield various fish species that can be caught with relatively simple equipment. Hook and line, nets, weirs, even bare hands under certain conditions. Fish spoil quickly without refrigeration, so they're typically consumed immediately after catching or preserved through smoking and salting. Many frontier families with water access maintain fish traps or check lines regularly, harvesting protein almost as an afterthought. Foraging extends beyond hunting to include gathering plant materials that supplement the diet. Nuts, walnuts, hickory nuts, butternuts, chestnuts before the blight provide calories and fat during autumn months. Berries, Blackberries, raspberries, blueberries, strawberries offer summer sweetness and vitamin C. Wild greens, dandelion, lamb's quarters, pokeweed shoots, ramps provide spring vegetables before the garden produces. Mushrooms, if you know which species are safe, add variety and nutrition. Maple sap in late winter becomes syrup that sweetens the otherwise austere frontier diet. Historians still argue about the relative contribution of hunting and foraging to frontier family nutrition. In newly settled areas with abundant game, hunting might provide substantial protein. In more established areas where population pressure had reduced wildlife, cultivated plants and domestic animals supplied most of the diet. The balance shifted over time and varied by region, making generalizations difficult. Your hunt today unfolds with characteristic uncertainty. You wait in a promising location, rifle ready, senses alert. Time passes with the particular slowness that stationary hunting produces. Minutes feel like hours when you're holding perfectly still, fighting the urge to shift position, battling the boredom that creeps in despite your best intentions. A squirrel chatters somewhere nearby, a crow calls. The forest goes about its business indifferent to your presence, and then movement. Something at the edge of your vision, something that resolves into a shape, a deer, a small doe moving through the underbrush perhaps 60 yards away. Your heart rate accelerates. Your grip tightens on the rifle. You raise the weapon slowly, carefully aligning the sights, leading the target slightly to account for its movement, exhaling slowly, squeezing the trigger gradually. The flint strikes the frizzen, sparks shower into the pan, the main charge ignites with a satisfying boom, and the rifle kicks against your shoulder with familiar force. Through the cloud of gun smoke you see the deer stagger, take a few steps, and fall. Meat for the table. Success today, though tomorrow might bring hours of waiting with nothing to show. The forest gives, but it gives on its own schedule, according to its own rules. You begin the work of dressing the deer where it fell, opening the body cavity, removing organs, beginning the butchering process that will eventually provide venison for your family. It's bloody work, intimate work, the kind of direct engagement with food production that modern grocery shoppers never experience. Tonight there will be fresh meat. Tomorrow you'll begin the preserving, smoking and salting and drying to extend this bounty through the weeks ahead. The forest provides. You just have to know how to ask. The first frost arrives like a warning shot, crystal patterns etching the window and sending a clear message. Winter is coming, and if you're not ready, winter will kill you. The weeks ahead will determine whether your family survives the cold months in relative comfort, or faces desperate hardship as supplies dwindle. Food preservation isn't a hobby or a lifestyle choice, it's the difference between life and death. Let's talk about how you're going to stock your larder for the long darkness ahead. The root cellar represents your first line of defense against winter hunger. This underground chamber, dug into a hillside or beneath your cabin floor, maintains relatively constant temperatures year-round, cool enough in summer to slow spoilage, warm enough in winter to prevent freezing. The earth itself provides insulation, creating a natural refrigerator that requires no electricity, no ice, nothing but proper construction and intelligent use. Into this cellar go the products of your harvest. Potatoes fill bins along one wall, hundreds of pounds of them, carefully sorted to remove any damaged specimens that might rot and spread decay to their neighbours. Carrots and beets and turnips, their green tops twisted off, nestle in containers of slightly moist sand that keeps them crisp without encouraging sprouting. Onions hang braided by their stems from the ceiling, along with garlic clusters and dried peppers. Cabbages sit in rows, whole heads that will be drawn upon through winter for sauerkraut, coleslaw, and boiled accompaniments to the eternal salt pork. Apples fill barrels, each fruit individually wrapped in paper or straw to prevent one rotten apple from literally spoiling the bunch. Here's a historical fact. The root cellar's design mattered enormously to its effectiveness. Too warm and food spoiled too quickly. Too cold and freezing damaged vegetables and promoted rot. Too damp and mould proliferated. Too dry and stored produce shriveled. The ideal balance came from experience, from generations of trial and error, from the accumulated wisdom of families who had learned which configurations worked in their particular soil and climate. Canning, in the sense of sealing food in glass jars with heat processing, is just beginning to develop during the 1800s. Nicolas Appert developed the basic technique in France around 1800, and it gradually spreads through the century, eventually becoming the dominant preservation method by century's end. But for much of the 1800s, and particularly on the frontier far from commercial goods, older preservation methods remain standard. Salt is perhaps the most important preservation ingredient, and its value explains why salt was once as precious as currency. Meat packed in salt, vegetables layered with salt, fish buried in salt. The mineral draws moisture from food and creates an environment hostile to the bacteria that cause spoilage. Your salt pork, remember, is simply pig meat packed in salt until the salt penetrates throughout, rendering the flesh preserved almost indefinitely. The salt supply your family needs for preservation, cooking and livestock feeding might total £100 or more per year. If you're lucky enough to have a local salt source, a natural spring or lick, or even a commercial works within reasonable distance, you can obtain salt affordably. If not, salt becomes an expensive imported commodity that strains your limited cash resources. Some frontier families literally ration salt, using less than optimal amounts and accepting shorter preservation times as a consequence. Smoking adds another preservation layer, particularly for meats. The smokehouse, a small wooden structure with a controlled fire pit beneath hanging meat, exposes protein to wood smoke containing phenols and other compounds that inhibit bacterial growth. Smoking also dries the meat, removing the moisture that spoilage organisms need. A well-smoked ham can last for years under the right conditions, though most families consume their stores well before that. Here's a quirky detail. The type of wood used for smoking affected the final product's flavour, and regional preferences developed accordingly. Hickory smoking dominated in much of the American South and Midwest, producing a strong distinctive flavour. Applewood and cherrywood gave milder, sweeter notes. Corncobs could be burned for smoking, imparting yet another flavour profile. These preferences, developed out of what was locally available, eventually became cultural traditions that persist in regional cuisine today. Drying preserves both fruits and vegetables, removing moisture to the point where bacterial and fungal growth becomes impossible. Apple slices, threaded on strings and hung near the fire, become dried apple rings that reconstitute into pie filling or sauce. Berries spread on trays in the sun become concentrated sweetness that stores in bags or jars. Beans left in their pods until completely dry can be stored almost indefinitely, providing protein through the months when fresh produce is unavailable. Jerky, strips of meat dried to leathery consistency, concentrates protein into a lightweight, portable, long-lasting form. Native American pemmican, combining dried meat with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries, provides an even more energy-dense preservation that sustained long journeys and hard winters. Frontier families adopted and adapted these indigenous preservation techniques, recognizing their practical value. Fermentation preserves through a different mechanism, encouraging beneficial bacteria that create acidic conditions inhospitable to spoilage organisms. Sauerkraut, already mentioned, is fermented cabbage, the vegetable's sugars converted to lactic acid by naturally occurring bacteria, producing a tangy preserved product that retains vitamin C through the winter. Pickles follow the same basic process. Cucumbers transform by brine and fermentation into crunchy preserved vegetables. Many cultures brought fermentation traditions to America: Korean kimchi, German sauerkraut, various Eastern European pickle styles, enriching the preservation repertoire available to frontier families. Vinegar, produced from fermented apple cider or other fruit juices, provides an acidic preservation medium for various foods. Pickled vegetables, pickled eggs, pickled fish, pickled just about anything. The vinegar's acidity prevents bacterial growth while adding its characteristic sour flavour. Vinegar production is a straightforward home process. Leave hard cider exposed to air, and the alcohol converts to acetic acid over several weeks, though it requires attention to prevent mould growth and off flavours. Sugar, when available, offers yet another preservation option. Fruit preserves, jams, and jellies suspend fruit in concentrated sugar that inhibits bacterial growth. The high sugar content of these products requires more sweetener than many frontier families can afford, making fruit preserves somewhat of a luxury. Honey and maple syrup can substitute for sugar in some preservation applications, extending availability beyond families with cash for imported cane sugar. Historians still argue about the nutritional adequacy of frontier winter diets. The preserved foods available, salt pork, dried corn, root vegetables, fermented cabbage, provided calories and some nutrients, but fell short of the variety that optimal health requires. Scurvy, the vitamin C deficiency disease associated with sailors, occasionally appeared in frontier populations during long winters, when preserved foods ran low and no fresh produce could be obtained. Spring, with its first fresh greens and shoots, brought both relief from monotony and essential nutrients that winter diets lacked. Your preservation work extends across several weeks of intense effort. The smokehouse runs continuously, processing the pork from autumn slaughter. The root cellar fills gradually with organised stores. Strings of dried apples multiply near the kitchen fire. Crocks of sauerkraut bubble in corners, fermentation producing the tang that will enliven winter meals. Each day brings more work, more processing, more racing against the clock of approaching cold. The first significant snowfall finds you ready, or as ready as you can be. The cellar is stocked, the smokehouse has done its work, the firewood is piled high, the animals are settled into their winter quarters. You've done everything possible to prepare for the months ahead. Whether it will be enough depends on factors you can't control, how long and how cold the winter proves, whether illness strikes your family, whether your stores last until spring growth begins again. You've prepared, now you wait and hope and eat sparingly and count the weeks until warmth returns. Winter is survivable, you just have to be ready. The spinning wheel stands in the corner of your cabin, and your wife sits before it now, her foot working the treadle in steady rhythm, her hands guiding raw wool into the mechanism that transforms fibre into thread. The sound, a low hum punctuated by the whoosh of the large wheel, forms the background music of domestic life. Clothing, you see, doesn't come from stores out here. Clothing comes from sheep and flax plants, and hours upon hours of tedious, essential labour. Let's trace a garment from field to body. Start with the sheep, if you keep them. Each spring the animals need shearing, removing the thick wool coat that kept them warm through winter, and that would make them miserable in summer heat. Shearing requires skill to avoid cutting the sheep and experience to remove the fleece efficiently. The wool comes off ideally in one piece, a greasy matted mass that looks nothing like the soft fabric it will eventually become. The raw fleece must be washed to remove lanolin, the natural oil that protects sheep against weather, and the considerable amount of dirt, vegetable matter, and other debris that accumulates in a year of outdoor living. This washing, called scouring, typically happens in a stream or with heated water, repeatedly soaking and rinsing until the wool feels clean rather than greasy. The process is smelly, time-consuming, and absolutely necessary. Clean wool then requires carding, combing with special paddles studded with wire teeth that align the fibres and prepare them for spinning. Imagine brushing tangled hair, multiplied by hundreds of iterations across pounds of fibre. The work produces smooth rolls of aligned fibre called rolags, ready for the spinning wheel. Spinning transforms loose fibre into continuous thread through a process that feels like magic until you understand the physics. The spinner feeds fibre to the wheel while introducing twist that locks the fibres together. The twist travels up the forming thread while new fibre feeds continuously from the rolag. An experienced spinner maintains a rhythm almost unconsciously, her hands knowing through years of practice exactly how much fibre to feed and how fast to twist. Here's a historical fact. A single shirt might require hours of spinning to produce enough thread, and that's after the washing, carding, and other preparation steps. Before the spinning wheel's widespread adoption, it arrived in Europe from India perhaps around the 13th century. Spinning happened on simple spindles that required even more time and attention. The spinning wheel represented technological advancement that dramatically improved productivity, but dramatic improvement still meant slow, laborious work by modern standards. The thread coming off the wheel isn't yet fabric, it's just thread, thin, fragile, needing further processing before becoming wearable. The thread may be dyed at this stage, coloured with natural dyes derived from plants, insects and minerals. Indigo gives blue, madder gives red, walnut hulls give brown, various plants give yellows and greens. The dyeing process involves mordants, chemicals that help dye bind to fibre, and careful temperature control, and considerable experience to achieve consistent colours. Many families didn't bother with dyeing, accepting natural wool colours, white, brown, black, or producing undyed fabric for practical garments. Weaving transforms thread into fabric on a loom, a wooden frame that holds lengthwise threads. The warp, while the weaver passes crosswise threads, the weft, through them in an over-under pattern. Simple looms might be nothing more than a frame with the warp stretched across. Complex looms incorporate foot pedals, treadles, that raise and lower groups of warp threads, allowing faster weaving of patterned fabrics. Either way, producing a yard of cloth takes hours, and a complete garment requires yards. Here's a quirky detail. Coverlets, decorative woven blankets with complex patterns, represented the pinnacle of home weaving achievement. A skilled weaver could produce elaborate designs by controlling which warp threads rose on each pass of the weft, creating geometric patterns that demonstrated both technical proficiency and artistic sensibility. These coverlets served as display pieces, wedding gifts, and markers of household status. Not all cloth came from sheep's wool. Flax plants produce fibres that become linen, a cloth prized for its coolness in summer and its smooth texture against skin. Processing flax is even more laborious than processing wool. The plants must be harvested, soaked to rot away the outer stalks, a smelly process called retting, dried, broken to separate fibres from stems, and repeatedly combed to clean and align the fibres before spinning. Linen production was so labour-intensive that many frontier families simply didn't attempt it, either going without linen or purchasing imported fabric. Cotton, that fibre that would transform American industry and entangle the nation in the horrors of slavery, appeared on frontier farms in limited quantities. Raw cotton required even more processing than wool or flax, cleaning the fibre of seeds and debris, carding, spinning, and the plant grew commercially only in warmer southern regions. Northern frontier families might occasionally purchase cotton fabric, but they rarely produced it themselves. Once you have fabric, finally, you can begin making clothes, and this too demands extensive skill and labour. Garments must be designed, their pieces planned to fit the wearer while using fabric efficiently, as every scrap has value. Patterns might be passed down through families, shared among neighbours, or invented from necessity. Cutting requires precision. A mistake might waste precious fabric that cannot be replaced. Sewing happens by hand, stitch by stitch, by the light of fireplace or candle. A plain shirt might require thousands of stitches to complete. More complex garments, fitted bodices, tailored coats, require more stitches still, plus the skill to shape flat fabric into three-dimensional forms that move with the body. Women typically handled most sewing, but men might tackle certain tasks, and specialised tailors existed in towns for those who could afford their services. Historians still argue about how much clothing frontier families actually produced versus purchased. Complete self-sufficiency in clothing was rare even on isolated farms. Buttons, thread, pins and needles almost always came from stores, along with finer fabrics for special occasions. But basic garments, work clothes, everyday wear, these often came from home production, especially in regions far from commercial goods. The clothing your family owns reflects this reality. Work clothes are rough, often patched multiple times, worn until they literally cannot be repaired further. The children wear hand-me-downs, garments passing from oldest to youngest, resized and repaired along the way. Sunday clothes, good clothes for church and special occasions, receive careful treatment, stored properly, worn only when necessary. A new garment represents a substantial investment of materials and labour. Acquiring too many clothing items is simply not possible. Your wife finishes her spinning session, winding the completed thread onto a spool, adding it to the accumulating stores that will eventually become fabric, become clothing, become warmth against the winter cold. She's been spinning since childhood, learning from her mother, who learned from her mother, the skill passing through generations of women who understood that survival required mastering these tedious, essential arts. The spinning wheel falls silent, but tomorrow, or the next day, or next week, it will hum again. The work is never finished because the need for clothing never ends. Garments wear out, children grow, the family's textile requirements continue regardless of whether anyone wants to spin more wool. From sheep to shirt, from flaxfield to linen, from raw material to finished garment. The journey is long, demanding, and absolutely essential to survival. In an era before factories and ready-to-wear clothes, you're wearing that journey right now, in the shirt on your back and the trousers on your legs. Every thread represents labour. Every stitch represents skill. Every garment represents the quiet triumph of making something from almost nothing. Your daughter has been coughing for 3 days now, and the cough is getting worse. At night, you hear her struggling for breath, the wet, rattling sound that suggests fluid gathering in her lungs. Her forehead is warm to the touch, warmer than it should be, and she's stopped asking for food. In the modern world, you drive to a clinic, perhaps receive antibiotics, almost certainly receive accurate diagnosis and effective treatment. In the 1800s, you're on your own. Let's talk about what happens when illness strikes a frontier farm. The nearest doctor, if one exists in your region at all, might be 10 miles away, or 20 or 50. Summoning a doctor means sending someone on horseback or foot, waiting hours or days for the doctor to arrive, and then paying fees that might represent weeks of cash income. For a simple illness, a cold, minor injury, ordinary childhood complaints, calling the doctor seems wasteful. For a serious illness, calling the doctor might not help anyway. Medical knowledge in the 1800s is limited enough that doctors often can't do much more than educated guessing and hopeful treatment. Here's a historical fact that might surprise you. Medical training in early 1800s America ranged from substantial to essentially non-existent. Some doctors had studied at established medical schools, learned anatomy, understood prevailing theories about disease. Others had simply apprenticed with existing doctors, learning through observation and practice without formal education. Still others simply declared themselves doctors and began practicing, with no training whatsoever. Licensing requirements varied by state and were often unenforced. Historians still argue about whether early American doctors, on average, helped more patients than they harmed. The prevailing medical theory for much of this period involves humoral medicine, the belief that health depends on proper balance among 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and that illness results from imbalance. Treatment focuses on restoring balance through bleeding, removing excess blood, purging, inducing vomiting or diarrhea to expel harmful substances, and various medications intended to shift the humoral equilibrium. From a modern perspective, these treatments are not only ineffective but often actively harmful, weakening patients who need strength to fight infection, dehydrating people who need fluids, occasionally killing people who might have recovered without intervention. Your family, facing illness, turns first to folk remedies, treatments passed down through generations, learned from neighbours, sometimes borrowed from Native American healing traditions. These remedies mix the ineffective with the occasionally useful in ways that would frustrate modern physicians. For your daughter's cough, you might try onion syrup, raw onions sliced and layered with sugar, the resulting liquid administered by the spoonful. The honey and lemon approach appears in various formulations, soothing throats if not curing underlying illness. Poultices of various substances, mustard, onion, bread and milk, bacon grease, get applied to the chest in hopes of drawing out the illness. Hot tea with various herbal additions, elderflower, boneset, horehound, provides hydration and perhaps mild therapeutic effect. Rest, warmth, fluids, the basic supportive care that actually does help, even if the specific remedies don't. Here's a quirky detail. Patent medicines, commercially produced, heavily advertised remedies claiming to cure everything from consumption to constipation, become wildly popular during the 1800s. These products often contain alcohol, opium, or other substances that make patients feel better temporarily, without addressing underlying conditions. Some are merely useless, others are actively dangerous. Almost none deliver on their extravagant promises, yet desperate families buy them anyway, because hope comes in bottles as well as prayers. Let's talk about childbirth and its dangers, because this deserves particular attention. A woman in 1800s America might bear 5, 6, 10 or more children over her reproductive years. Each pregnancy carries genuine risk. Complications that would be managed routinely in modern hospitals could prove fatal in a frontier cabin. Childbirth happens at home, attended by midwives or neighbouring women with childbirth experience, sometimes with no attendance at all, when labour progresses too quickly. Midwives in this era possess practical knowledge accumulated through attending many births, but their understanding of what can go wrong and how to address it is necessarily limited. A normal delivery proceeds with little intervention: support, encouragement, patience. An abnormal delivery, breech presentation, prolonged labour, hemorrhage, cord prolapse, presents challenges that may exceed the midwife's capabilities. Caesarean sections exist but are almost always fatal to the mother. They're performed only as desperate last resorts when the mother is already dying. Puerperal fever, also called childbed fever, kills thousands of women after apparently successful deliveries. The infection, caused by bacteria introduced during delivery or examination, produces fever, abdominal pain, and often death within days. The connection between unwashed hands and childbed fever won't be established until later in the century. Oliver Wendell Holmes suggests it in 1843. Ignaz Semmelweis demonstrates it more definitively in the 1840s. And even then, many doctors resist the implication that they themselves spread disease. Historians still argue about how many women died preventably from childbed fever during the decades before hand-washing became standard practice. Infant mortality presents another grim reality. Perhaps one child in 5 dies before reaching age 1, and another one in 5 dies before age 5. The causes are various. Infectious diseases, measles, whooping cough, scarlet fever, diphtheria, diarrheal illness from contaminated water or food, accidents, malnutrition, and simply the vulnerability of small bodies to threats that adults can withstand. Families expect to lose children. They prepare emotionally for losses that seem inevitable. The cemetery on your property, or the community burial ground, contains small graves that tell this story. Specific diseases sweep through communities with terrifying regularity. Smallpox, before widespread vaccination, kills tens of thousands and leaves survivors scarred for life. Cholera epidemics spread along rivers and trade routes, killing within hours of first symptoms. Typhoid fever strikes wherever sanitation is poor, which is almost everywhere. Malaria affects large portions of the American landscape, causing recurring fevers that weaken without necessarily killing. Tuberculosis, the White Death, kills slowly over months or years, spreading through families and communities. Your daughter continues coughing, and you continue your ministrations. You brew tea, prepare poultices, keep her warm, try to get her to drink fluids. You pray, if you're religious, asking divine intervention that you know may not come. You wait and watch, and hope that her young body fights off whatever is attacking it. And in many cases, bodies do fight off infections. Many sick people recover, not because of treatment but despite it, their immune systems prevailing against invaders. The success of folk remedies often reflects this natural recovery rather than any therapeutic effect of the remedy itself. People got better after drinking willowbark tea and concluded the tea caused the improvement when actually the body healed itself. After several difficult days, your daughter's cough begins to ease, her appetite returns, the fever breaks. You're not sure which remedy helped or whether any did, but she's recovering, and that's what matters, this time, this illness. The next time might go differently. You know this. Every parent knows this. The spectre of childhood death hangs over every family, every fever, every cough that seems to linger too long. You do what you can, you hope for the best. You accept that some things lie beyond your control. This is medicine in the 1800s. Uncertainty, hope, and the stubborn resilience of the human body against challenges both natural and man-made. The sounds coming from behind the curtained-off corner of the cabin have grown more urgent over the past hour. Your wife labours there, attended by the neighbour woman who serves as midwife for this scattered community, bringing a new life into a world that offers no guarantees about how long that life will last. You've been sent outside. Childbirth is women's business, you've been told, and you pace the yard, listening, hoping, fearing. Let's witness this dangerous passage together. Labour begins, typically, with cramping that a woman recognises from previous deliveries, or learns to identify through the descriptions of more experienced women. The contractions start mild and far apart, building gradually over hours toward the intense, frequent waves that signal active labour and imminent delivery. In favourable circumstances, the entire process might take 6 to 12 hours. In less favourable circumstances, it might extend for days. Your wife has borne children before. This will be her 4th delivery, and her body knows what to do even as her mind endures the pain. There is no anaesthesia available, no epidural to dull sensation, nothing but perhaps a glass of whiskey or a dose of laudanum, tincture of opium, to take the edge off suffering. She grips the hands of the attending women, bears down when her body demands it, rests between contractions, and proceeds through the ancient process that every mother before her has navigated. The midwife, Mrs. Henderson from 3 farms over, has attended perhaps 200 births in her career. She learned her skills from her own mother, who learned from her mother, an apprenticeship tradition stretching back generations. She knows what normal labour looks like, recognizes warning signs of complication, understands the range of presentations and positions that babies assume. Her hands are experienced, her demeanour calm, her presence reassuring to labouring women who benefit from confidence and competence at their most vulnerable moments. Here's a historical fact. Midwifery represented one of the few professions open to women in this era, and skilled midwives commanded respect and sometimes substantial income. In rural areas, midwives might travel significant distances to attend deliveries, staying for days if necessary, providing not just delivery assistance but postpartum care for mother and infant. The transition from midwife-attended home births to physician-attended hospital births, which accelerates through the late 1800s and 1900s, represents a significant shift in how American women experience childbirth. The delivery itself, when conditions are favourable, follows a predictable sequence. The cervix dilates, opens, through the hours of labour, eventually allowing the baby's head to pass through. The baby descends through the birth canal, rotates to fit through the pelvic opening, emerges first the head, then shoulders, then body. The cord is cut, the placenta delivers, the mother and infant begin their new relationship. But conditions are not always favourable. Breech presentation, when the baby's bottom or feet, rather than head, lead the way, complicates delivery and increases risks for both mother and child. Mrs. Henderson has delivered breech babies before, using techniques to guide limbs and body through the birth canal, but she knows that breech deliveries carry greater danger of cord compression, birth injury, and maternal trauma. Prolonged labour, when hours stretch into days without progress, exhausts mothers and raises concerns about fetal distress. Something might be blocking progress. An unusually large baby, an unusually small pelvis, a presentation that won't navigate the birth canal regardless of how long labour continues. When labour stalls completely, options in the 1800s are limited and grim. Hemorrhage, severe bleeding during or after delivery, can kill a mother within minutes if not controlled. The placenta normally separates from the uterine wall and delivers without incident, but sometimes separation is incomplete, or the uterus fails to contract properly to stanch bleeding, or tears in the birth canal bleed uncontrollably. Modern obstetrics has multiple interventions for hemorrhage. 1800s midwives have pressure, prayers and hope. Here's a quirky detail. Various folk beliefs surrounded childbirth, some rooted in observation and some in superstition. Knots of any kind in the delivery room might be untied to prevent knotting of the umbilical cord. Windows might be opened to give the child an easy entrance to the world. The father's boots might be placed under the bed to ease labour. Whether any of these practices had any effect seems unlikely, but they gave worried participants something to do while nature took its course. The sounds from behind the curtain reach a crescendo, urgent voices, a final cry of effort, and then, unmistakably, the wail of a newborn announcing its arrival. You exhale a breath you didn't realise you'd been holding. The baby is born. Your wife has survived. The danger isn't over. Infection and hemorrhage can strike in the coming hours and days, but the immediate crisis has passed. You're invited inside finally to meet the new member of your family. Your wife lies exhausted but triumphant, the infant at her breast learning to nurse. Mrs. Henderson tidying up the evidence of delivery with practiced efficiency. The baby is small, newborns always seem impossibly small, but appears healthy, all fingers and toes accounted for, lungs clearly functional based on the volume of crying. The postpartum period brings its own challenges. Your wife needs rest but won't get much of it, not with a newborn demanding feeding every few hours and other children requiring attention. She needs to recover physically from the trauma of delivery while immediately assuming care responsibilities. She needs to establish breastfeeding, which doesn't always proceed smoothly. Some women don't produce sufficient milk, some babies don't latch effectively. Some circumstances make nursing difficult or impossible. Maternal mortality rates in 1800s, America runs somewhere between 1 and 2% per delivery. That sounds low until you multiply it by the number of deliveries a typical woman experiences. 5 deliveries means roughly a 1 in 10 chance that childbirth kills you eventually. 10 deliveries approaches 1 in 5 odds. Women understood these statistics viscerally, even without formal calculation. They watched friends, sisters, mothers die in childbirth. They wrote wills before delivery. They prepared mentally and spiritually for outcomes they couldn't control. Historians still argue about whether the transition to physician-attended births improved or worsened maternal outcomes. Physicians brought instruments, forceps that could extract stuck babies for example, but also brought higher rates of puerperal fever before hand-washing became standard. Hospitals concentrated sick patients, potentially increasing infection risk. The statistical evidence is mixed, suggesting that location and attendant type mattered less than overall sanitation and the luck of avoiding complications that no intervention could address. Your new child will join the family, learning to walk and talk, eventually taking on chores alongside siblings, eventually perhaps marrying and having children of their own. Or your new child will join the smaller statistics, the babies lost to fever, to diarrhea, to the 100 hazards that claim infant lives with cruel regularity. You won't know which trajectory this child will follow for years yet. For now, though, the baby is here. Your wife is alive. The delivery went well, considering. You offer thanks to God if you're religious, to Mrs. Henderson regardless, for this successful navigation of danger. The cycle continues. Another generation begins. The family grows. The small grave under the oak tree, marked with a simple wooden cross that will weather and fade within a few years, holds your youngest daughter. She was 3. She caught fever, like children do, but the fever didn't break, and after 4 terrible days she slipped away while you held her hand. The date is carved into your memory like it's carved into nothing else, because wooden crosses don't last and gravestones cost money you don't have. Let's acknowledge what you already know. Death is your neighbour here, visiting more frequently than any welcome friend. The statistics are stark. In early 1800s America, roughly 1 child in 5 dies before reaching age 1. Another significant percentage die before age 5. By the time they reach adulthood, perhaps half of the children born to a typical family have survived. The other half claimed by disease, accident, or simple failure to thrive that nobody could explain. These numbers represent national averages. Frontier conditions, with less access to even the limited medical care available, might produce even grimmer outcomes. You've already lost children before this daughter. A son, stillborn, never drew breath. An infant girl who lived 3 weeks before succumbing to something that made her refuse to nurse. Now this daughter, old enough to have a personality, old enough to have called you Papa, old enough for her absence to leave a specific shaped hole in your daily life. The grief doesn't diminish with repetition. You just learn to carry it alongside everything else you carry. Here's a historical fact. Mourning practices in the 1800s reflected this intimate familiarity with death. Elaborate funeral customs developed among those who could afford them. Black clothing, formal periods of mourning, specific etiquette governing social behaviour after bereavement. But on the frontier, where resources were scarce and work never stopped, mourning took simpler forms. You buried your dead, you grieved as you could, you returned to the labour that survival demanded because the living still needed feeding and the animals still needed tending. The graveyard where your daughter lies might be a family plot on your own land, or a community cemetery at the church or crossroads. Family plots were common on isolated farms, digging a grave, conducting a service, marking the spot with whatever memorial you could manage. These small cemeteries dotted the landscape, often forgotten when land changed hands, sometimes discovered by later generations who wondered about the weathered stones and unmarked depressions in the earth. Children's graves particularly proliferate. Small stones, small markers, sometimes just wooden crosses that rotted within a decade, commemorating brief lives that ended before they really began. Died in infancy appears on countless 1800s markers, a phrase that covers everything from hours to months, acknowledging that the child existed without having time to accumulate much individual history worth recording. Adult deaths came too, of course, though less frequently in absolute terms. A man might be killed by a falling tree, a kicked horse, an infected wound that turned septic before anyone realised how serious it was. A woman might die in childbirth, or from childbed fever afterward, or from the accumulated strain of too many pregnancies too close together on a body that never fully recovered between them. Middle age arrived early by modern standards. A 40-year-old farmer was genuinely old, his body worn by decades of hard labour, his joints aching, his strength diminished. Here's a quirky detail. The widow's weeds, the black clothing worn during mourning, became so standardised that widows sometimes dyed their everyday dresses black rather than purchasing new garments. The dyeing process itself was laborious, involving multiple applications and careful technique to achieve true black rather than muddy grey. Some widows wore mourning for the rest of their lives. Others observed prescribed mourning periods of 1 or 2 years before returning to normal dress. Accidental deaths haunted farm families in ways that seem preventable by modern standards. Children drowned in wells, in ponds, in rain barrels left uncovered. Men died from wounds that became infected. A simple cut, improperly cleaned, could lead to blood poisoning and death within days. Women burned to death when their long skirts caught fire at the hearth. People were trampled by livestock, thrown from horses, crushed by falling equipment. The world contained dangers that are difficult to appreciate today, when safety regulations and emergency services have removed many of the deadliest hazards from daily life. Grief, processed in whatever time could be spared, manifested in various ways. Some families preserved locks of hair from the deceased, weaving them into jewellery or keeping them in lockets as physical mementos. Some maintained mourning altars with photographs later in the century, or paintings of lost loved ones. Some channeled grief into religious practice, finding comfort in beliefs about heaven and eventual reunion. Some simply endured, compartmentalizing pain to function through days that offered no opportunity for extended reflection. Your wife has returned from the grave now, her face composed but her eyes red from crying. She has work to do, there's always work to do, and she begins it mechanically, her hands busy with tasks they could perform in her sleep. You watch her for a moment, sharing silent grief, then turn to your own labour. The corn needs tending, the animals need feeding. Life continues even when it seems impossible that it should. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of high mortality on frontier families. Did the frequency of death make it easier to bear, a normalised part of existence rather than a shocking disruption? Or did repeated losses compound, each new grave reopening the wounds of previous ones? The evidence, what we have of it, suggests wide variation. Some families seem to develop resilience, others were devastated by loss after loss. Human beings adapt, but adaptation isn't the same as thriving. Your daughter's absence changes the pattern of daily life. The chair at the table where she sat, the bed where she slept, the chores she had begun to help with, the constant presence she represented. You catch yourself looking for her, expecting to hear her voice, forgetting for a moment that she's gone. This will continue for months, perhaps years, the small shocks of remembrance, the wounds that reopen unexpectedly. But it's not just the individual loss that weighs on you, it's the knowledge that this will happen again. Another child might fall ill, another accident might claim someone you love, another grave might join the one under the oak tree. You can't protect them all, you can't guarantee anyone's survival, you can only do your best and hope for outcomes you can't control. The oak tree shades the grave, its leaves rustling in the wind. You'll plant flowers there eventually when spring comes, something to mark the spot with beauty rather than just absence. For now, though, there's work to be done. There's always work to be done. You wipe your eyes, pick up your tools, and return to the endless business of survival. The one-room schoolhouse stands perhaps 2 miles from your farm, a rough wooden building that looks like a cabin crossed with a shed, and your older children walk there on days when they're not needed for farm work. Which is to say, they walk there sometimes when circumstances permit, when education can compete with survival for your family's attention. Learning to read and write and cipher might improve their prospects in life, but learning to farm keeps them alive right now. Let's explore what education looks like on the frontier. The schoolhouse serves perhaps 20 to 30 families scattered across several miles of countryside. Students range in age from 5 or 6 to teenagers, all crowded into a single room, all taught by a single teacher whose qualifications might be extensive or minimal depending on who could be recruited to serve. The building itself is primitive. Rough benches for seating, a fireplace or stove for heat, perhaps a few windows for light, a simple desk or table for the teacher. In warm months, the interior is stifling. In cold months, students near the fire roast while those at the edges shiver. Here's a historical fact. The school year in rural areas typically ran from late fall through early spring, the dead season for farming when children could be spared from agricultural labour. This schedule, essentially inverted from modern expectations, ensured that young people remained available for planting and harvest, the critical periods when every able body was needed in the fields. Summer vacation, which modern students take for granted, originally existed precisely because farm children needed to work, not because anyone thought children deserved a break. Your children, on days they attend, leave before dawn to cover the 2 miles on foot. They carry lunch, perhaps cornbread and an apple, whatever can be eaten cold, and any school supplies they might possess, which might be precious little. Paper costs money. Many students practice writing on slate boards that can be erased and reused indefinitely. Books cost money. The schoolroom might possess a few shared volumes that students take turns using. Ink costs money. Homemade inks from berry juice or oak gall substitute when commercial ink isn't available. The teacher, if male, might be an itinerant scholar working his way through the countryside, teaching for a season before moving on. If female, and women increasingly enter teaching during this period, she might be a local young woman with more education than most, earning modest wages while waiting for marriage. Teacher salaries were low. Accommodation often consisted of boarding round, living with student families in rotation, and job security was non-existent. A teacher who displeased parents or school trustees could be dismissed instantly. Here's a quirky detail. Teachers in frontier schools often boarded with student families on a rotating basis, spending a week or two with each household in turn. This arrangement reduced cash salary requirements. Room and board had real value, but created its own complications. Teachers experienced the full range of frontier living conditions, from the relatively comfortable to the thoroughly wretched. Students whose families were hosting the teacher might feel awkward pressure. Families might resent the burden of additional mouths to feed. What did students actually learn? Reading, first and foremost, the ability to decode written text, essential for participating in religious life, reading the Bible, economic life, reading contracts and documents, and civic life, reading newspapers and political information. Reading instruction often used the Bible itself as textbook, or perhaps the McGuffey readers that became ubiquitous later in the century, or whatever printed material the school happened to possess. Writing followed reading, though not all students who learned to read progressed to fluent writing. Forming letters, practicing penmanship, eventually composing original text. These skills developed gradually through repetitive practice. The Palmer method of handwriting instruction, with its emphasis on arm movement and uniform letter forms, wouldn't become standard until later, but earlier instruction still stressed legibility and neatness. Arithmetic, ciphering and period vocabulary provided practical mathematical skills for a commercial society. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, with applications to real-world problems, calculating prices, measuring materials, dividing inheritance. More advanced students might tackle fractions, percentages, basic geometry, the mathematical operations needed for navigation or surveying. Algebra and higher mathematics remained exotic subjects studied mainly by those headed for professional careers. Memorization dominated instruction methods. Students learned their lessons by heart, reciting them aloud to demonstrate mastery, repeating material until it stuck permanently. The mental discipline theory of education held that exercising memory strengthened the mind generally, like exercise strengthening muscles. Modern educational research has complicated this theory, but in the 1800s it seemed self-evidently true. Historians still argue about literacy rates in 1800s America, partly because literacy means different things in different contexts. Basic functional literacy, the ability to read simple texts and write one's name, was fairly widespread, perhaps 70 to 80% among white Americans by mid-century. Deep literacy, the ability to read complex material, write fluently, engage with sophisticated ideas, was considerably rarer and correlated strongly with economic status and geographic location. The hours spent at school pale compared to the hours spent working. Your children might attend school 40 or 50 days per year, perhaps 100 in good years when farm labour demands are lower than usual. The rest of their education comes from experience, learning farm skills from you, learning domestic skills from their mother, learning life lessons from the daily struggle for survival. This practical education matters as much as book learning, maybe more, for people whose futures likely involve farming rather than professional careers. Your daughter returns from school today, eager to show you what she's learned. She can read simple sentences now, sounding out words from the battered primer that the school shares among students. She can write her name, and the names of family members, in letters that wobble but are recognisably correct. She can add small numbers in her head, calculating the kind of sum she'll need for market transactions. It's not much by the standards of her urban contemporaries, but it's something. A foundation that might support further learning if circumstances ever permit. Her brother, older and stronger, attends less frequently. His labour is needed more urgently, and the family has made a pragmatic calculation. The boy will farm, so farming skills matter more than book skills. It's not fair, perhaps. It denies him opportunities that education might provide. But fairness is a luxury that frontier families often cannot afford. The schoolhouse will close for the season soon as spring planting demands begin. The children will return to the fields, their lessons suspended until next fall. The teacher will move on, or take summer work, or board with some family and assist with chores until school resumes. Education exists on the frontier, but it exists in the gaps between more urgent demands. It's a luxury, somewhat, even as it's also a necessity for full participation in American society. Your children learn what they can, when they can, and hope it's enough. It's Sunday, and for the first time in 3 weeks, a circuit preacher has arrived to conduct services. You've put on your good clothes, the clothes you save for occasions like this, and you're walking with your family toward the Hendersons' barn, which is larger than any cabin in the area, and therefore serves as the gathering place when a preacher comes through. Faith on the frontier doesn't look like faith in cities with grand churches. Faith out here looks like neighbours crowded into a hay-scented space, singing hymns without hymnals, listening to a travelling preacher who might not return for months. Let's explore the role of religion in farm family survival. The circuit riding system developed as a practical response to scattered populations that couldn't support full-time ministers. A circuit rider, typically Methodist or Baptist in this period, travelled a regular route through multiple communities, conducting services in each location on a rotating schedule. Your circuit might see a preacher every 2 weeks, every month, even less frequently in sparsely settled areas. Between visits, religious observance happened at home, family prayers, Bible reading by those who could read, Sunday routines that maintained spiritual connection without formal services. Here's a historical fact. The Second Great Awakening, a massive religious revival that swept America in the early 1800s, profoundly shaped frontier religious practice. Camp meetings, multi-day outdoor gatherings featuring continuous preaching, intense emotional expression, and collective religious experience drew thousands of participants and converted even more. The religious fervour generated by these revivals emphasised personal salvation, emotional connection with the divine, and relatively egalitarian theology that appealed to frontier individualism. The barn fills with your neighbours, perhaps 30 or 40 people representing the scattered farms for miles around. You know everyone, at least by name, the Hendersons who host, the Wilsons from up the creek, the elderly Johnsons who've been here longest, the young couple just establishing their farm to the west. This gathering serves social functions as well as religious ones. You'll exchange news, conduct business, arrange mutual aid, perhaps negotiate a marriage or settle a dispute. The preacher provides the occasion, but the community provides the real value. The service begins with singing, hymns known by heart, learned from childhood, sung without accompaniment in the call and response style that frontier congregations favour. The voices blend imperfectly, some too high, some too low, some off-key, but the earnest effort creates its own kind of beauty. The familiar words connect you to your parents, your grandparents, the generations of believers who sang these same hymns in different places. The preacher begins his sermon, and it's clear he's building towards something. Circuit preachers develop styles suited to their challenging audiences, dramatic delivery, vivid language, emotional appeals that cut through the fatigue and monotony of daily life. Hellfire preaching, graphic descriptions of damnation awaiting the unrepentant, competed with message of grace and redemption. The theological emphasis varied by denomination and individual preacher, but the goal remained consistent, inspiring spiritual reflection and strengthening faith. Here's a quirky detail. Physical responses to powerful preaching were common and expected in frontier religious settings. Shouting, crying, falling down, slain in the spirit, jerking involuntarily, even barking, yes, barking, were all documented responses to revivalist preaching. These exercises were interpreted as evidence of divine presence, demonstrations that spiritual power was moving through the congregation. Critics considered them mass hysteria or manipulation. Believers experienced them as genuine encounter with the holy. Religion provided psychological benefits that extended far beyond Sunday services. The belief that suffering had meaning, that hardship was divine testing, that reward awaited in the afterlife, helped frontier families endure circumstances that might otherwise seem unbearably bleak. the conviction that a loving God watched over them, that prayers were heard even if not always answered as hoped, offered comfort against the constant proximity of death. Faith didn't make life easy, but it made life meaningful. The community aspects of religion mattered as much as the theological ones. Church gatherings brought isolated families together, creating the social bonds that made mutual aid possible. The minister who married you, who baptized your children, who would eventually bury you, served as witness to your life's major events. The congregation that gathered for worship would gather again for barn raisings, for harvest help, for support in crisis. Faith and community intertwined so thoroughly that separating them would have seemed nonsensical. Not everyone was religious, of course. Some frontier families maintained private skepticism or public indifference toward organized religion. Some had negative experiences with ministers or church institutions. Some simply couldn't spare the time and energy that religious participation required. But the dominant culture was thoroughly Christian, and those who stood outside it often found themselves socially marginalized in ways that had practical as well as spiritual consequences. Women particularly found in religion a sphere of valued activity. While excluded from most public roles, women could participate fully in church life, organizing aid societies, leading prayer groups, teaching Sunday school to children, singing in choirs where they existed. The moral authority that religious commitment conferred extended into domestic life, justifying women's influence over household management and child rearing. Historians still argue about whether religion empowered or constrained frontier women. The answer likely varied by individual circumstance. The service concludes with more singing than a closing prayer that asks divine blessing on the gathered families, on their crops and livestock, on their health and safety through the coming weeks. The preacher will eat dinner at one of the farms, conduct any marriages or baptisms that need performing, perhaps visit the sick if there are any reported, then continue on his circuit to the next community. You won't see him again for 3 weeks, maybe longer if weather or illness delays his rounds. But the community remains, strengthened by this gathering, reminded of the bonds that connect you across the miles of forest and field. You linger after the service, talking with neighbours, exchanging news, perhaps arranging to help with a task that requires more hands than one family provides. The children play together, a rare treat when playmates usually mean siblings. The women share recipe variations and pregnancy updates and concerns about aging parents. The men discuss crops, livestock, equipment, the endless practical matters that occupy farming minds. By afternoon you begin the walk home, tired from the socialising but renewed in some less tangible way. The sermon's message echoes in your mind, something about perseverance through trial, appropriate for an audience that perseveres constantly. The familiar hymns still hum in your memory. The faces of your neighbours remain present even as you return to isolation. Sunday ends, and Monday begins the cycle again. But for one day at least, you are part of something larger than your own struggling farm. For one day, you remembered that you're not alone out here. The framework of your new barn rises against the sky, skeletal beams and posts outlining the shape it will become. And all around you, neighbours work in a coordinated chaos that accomplishes more in one day than you could manage alone in months. This is a barn raising, the quintessential expression of frontier mutual aid, and watching it unfold helps explain how anyone survived in a world without insurance companies, government assistance, or professional contractors. Let's examine the art of community cooperation. The tradition of barn raising or house raising, or any large construction project requiring many hands, developed from pure necessity. Certain structures were simply too large and complex for a single family to build alone, yet families needed these structures to survive. The solution? Neighbours helped each other, contributing labour with the understanding that assistance given would eventually be assistance received. No formal contracts governed these arrangements. No money changed hands. The economy was one of obligation and reciprocity, tracked in the collective memory of the community. Here's a historical fact. Barn raisings typically followed established protocols regarding who did what. Experienced men directed the work, positioning beams and coordinating the dangerous moments when heavy timbers were hoisted into place. Younger men provided muscle, lifting and carrying and hauling. Women prepared enormous meals to feed the workers, a contribution equally essential to the project's success. Children ran errands, carried water, stayed out from underfoot. Everyone had a role suited to their capabilities. The barn rising before you represents weeks of preparation that preceded this day. You cut and squared the timbers during the winter, working whenever weather and other obligations permitted. You hauled stones for the foundation, laid them carefully to provide level support for the wooden structure above. You collected nails, hinges, hardware, all the metal components that couldn't be made locally and had to be purchased or bartered for. By the time you invited neighbours for the raising, the pieces were ready for assembly. The community provided the labour to put them together. The work proceeds with remarkable speed. Experienced hands know where each beam belongs, how joints fit together, which pegs secure which connections. A crew working at one corner coordinates with crews at other corners, the 4 sections rising in tandem until they're ready to be connected by the roof beams. By noon, the basic framework is complete, walls outlined in timber, the skeleton of a structure that will house your animals and store your harvest for years to come. Lunch is a festival, tables made from planks across sawhorses groaning under the dishes that wives and daughters have been preparing since dawn. Roast pork, chicken, beef for those who have it, pies and cakes and cobblers, vegetables from summer gardens, preserved foods from cellars, coffee, cider, perhaps something stronger for those who partake. The quantity reflects the importance of the occasion and the desire to provide hospitality that matches the labour being contributed. Here's a quirky detail. Barn raising day often became social occasion as much as work project. Young people flirted under the supervision of watchful parents. News and gossip circulated through conversations. Business arrangements were proposed and negotiated. Some communities used barn raisings as occasions for competitive games, tests of strength, races, other contests that let young men demonstrate prowess. The work was serious, but the atmosphere could be almost festive. After lunch, work resumes on the roof, the siding, the finishing details that transform framework into functional building. By evening, your barn stands substantially complete. Not finished in every detail, but enclosed, roofed, ready to shelter animals and crops. What would have taken you alone weeks or months of exhausting effort has been accomplished in a single long day of community cooperation. You'll repay this debt, of course. When your neighbour needs a barn, you'll be there. When another neighbour's house burns down, you'll contribute labour to the rebuilding. When someone falls sick at harvest time, you'll help bring in their crops before the weather turns. The mutual aid network functions because everyone both gives and receives, because refusing to help when called would mean being refused help when needed, because reputation in a small community determines whether you can survive at all. Historians still argue about whether these mutual aid networks represented genuine community spirit or calculated self-interest dressed in cooperative clothing. The truth probably includes both elements. People helped neighbours because they genuinely cared about their well-being and because they understood that their own well-being depended on maintaining helpful relationships. The motivations matter less than the outcomes. Structures got built, crises got addressed. Isolated families proved less isolated than geography suggested. Other forms of mutual aid extended beyond dramatic events like barn raisings. Neighbours loaned equipment too expensive for each family to own separately. A better plough, specialised tools, perhaps a breeding bull whose services multiple families needed. Neighbours shared knowledge, passing along techniques that worked, and warning against approaches that failed. Neighbours provided informal credit, accepting delayed payment for goods or services when cash was scarce. Neighbours witnessed documents, settled disputes, helped enforce the informal social order that maintained peaceful coexistence. The absence of mutual aid could be devastating. Families who violated community norms, who refused to help when called, who cheated in transactions, who behaved in ways the community considered unacceptable, might find themselves cut off from the support network. Sent to Coventry was the phrase, borrowed from English tradition, meaning shunned, ignored, left to manage alone. Few families could survive true isolation. The threat of exclusion therefore served as powerful social control. Your barn stands complete now, or nearly so. The neighbours are leaving, loading families into wagons, beginning journeys home before darkness falls. You shake hands, express gratitude, promise to reciprocate when opportunities arise. Your wife thanks the women who laboured in the kitchen, acknowledging their contribution as essential as the men's work on the structure itself. Tonight you'll sleep well, exhausted from the long day's work, but satisfied in a way that solitary labour rarely achieves. Tomorrow you'll begin the finishing work, adding interior partitions, building stalls, fitting doors and shutters, but the hard part is done through the power of community, done because your neighbours showed up when you needed them. Someday soon, you'll return the favour. The cycle continues. The community survives because individual families cannot survive alone. The general store smells like everything all at once. Coffee beans and a leather, pickle brine and tobacco, fabric bolts and gun oil. The accumulated scent of civilization imported into the wilderness. You've walked 5 miles to get here, leading a mule loaded with butter and eggs and whatever else your family has to trade. This small building, perhaps 20 feet by 30, represents your connection to the wider world, the place where surplus becomes goods, where isolation meets commerce, where the cash-poor economy of the frontier touches the money-based economy of cities and ports. Let's explore what happens inside. The general store in a rural area serves functions that modern society distributes among dozens of specialised institutions. It's a retail outlet, obviously, selling everything from needles to ploughs. It's a bank of sorts, extending credit and sometimes handling cash transactions when money actually changes hands. It's a post office, receiving and distributing mail for the surrounding countryside. It's a news source, as the shopkeeper collects and shares information from travellers and correspondents. It's a social centre, where customers linger to exchange gossip and conduct business with each other. The shopkeeper knows everyone, remembers everything, serves as unofficial community hub. Here's a historical fact. The credit system at country stores created complex webs of obligation that bound communities together economically. Most transactions occurred on account. Farmers brought their surplus produce, received credit toward their balance, then drew against that credit when purchasing goods. Cash rarely appeared. The store's books tracked who owed what to whom, with settlements happening annually or even less frequently. This system worked reasonably well when times were good, but could become disastrously constrictive when crop failures left farmers unable to repay their accumulated debts. You approach the counter, where the shopkeeper greets you by name. He knows your family, knows your farm, knows what you produce and what you need. He examines your butter with practiced eye and nose, assessing quality, calculating what he can offer in trade. The eggs get counted, candle illuminating each one to check for development that would render it unsaleable. The exchange rate today, butter at 12 cents per pound, eggs at 8 cents per dozen, though these aren't necessarily cash prices, they're credit values that might be different if actual money were involved. The store's inventory reflects the needs and desires of its rural customers. Tools dominate one section: axes, hoes, shovels, scythes, the implements that farming requires and that can't be made at home. Hardware fills another area: nails, hinges, screws, hooks, the metal components that hold structures together. Fabric occupies significant space: bolts of cotton and wool, calico prints and solid colours, materials for the clothes that farm wives will sew. Household goods cluster together: needles, thread, buttons, dishes, pots, the endless small necessities of domestic life. The items you can't produce yourself at all are the ones you need most from the store: sugar, coffee, tea, salt, pepper, spices, the imported goods that add flavour and preservation capacity to your homegrown diet. Glass, window glass, jar glass, lamp chimneys, requires manufacturing capabilities far beyond frontier forges: metal in all its forms, iron bar stock for the local blacksmith, steel needles and scissors, tin cups and pans, medicines such as they are, patent remedies, laudanum, quinine, substances that might help or might simply help you feel like you're trying something. Here's a quirky detail: literacy mattered at the general store because labels mattered. A customer who couldn't read might accidentally purchase the wrong product, or be cheated by an unscrupulous shopkeeper substituting inferior goods. Shopkeepers learned to work with illiterate customers, describing products, explaining labels, sometimes colour-coding or otherwise marking items to prevent confusion. The interaction was a negotiation requiring trust on both sides. Your shopping list today includes salt, essential for preservation and cooking, and coffee, which has become enough of a habit that doing without seems unnecessarily austere. You need needles. The last one broke, and sewing without a needle is essentially impossible. You need nails for a repair project at home. You'd like fabric for a new shirt, but that depends on how much credit your butter and eggs generate and how much credit you already owe. The shopkeeper tallies your credits, subtracts your previous balance, informs you of what remains for purchasing. The arithmetic is not quite enough for everything you wanted. The fabric will have to wait for next time. You select your priorities: salt and coffee first, then needles, then nails if credit stretches that far, and watch as items are wrapped in paper, or placed in the bag you've brought. The transaction complete, you linger for a moment, absorbing the news that circulates through this hub. A new family is moving in somewhere to the east. Someone's cow died, maybe disease. Be careful if your animals contact theirs. The price of wheat in Cincinnati has dropped, which matters if you're planning to sell surplus. A peddler is expected through next week carrying goods the store doesn't stock. Information flows freely here, because everyone benefits from everyone knowing what's happening. Historians still argue about whether general stores exploited frontier farmers or served them. The credit system that kept farmers perpetually in debt could certainly feel exploitative, especially when poor harvests made repayment impossible. But the alternative, requiring cash for every transaction, would have been equally difficult in a cash-scarce economy. The store provided essential goods that couldn't be obtained otherwise, accepted payment in kind when money wasn't available, and filled functions that no other institution could. The relationship was complicated, like most economic relationships. Your mule loaded with purchases, you begin the 5-mile walk home. The coffee will be a pleasure tonight, a small luxury that makes the endless cornmeal monotony slightly more bearable. The salt will preserve food that keeps your family alive. The needles will repair clothes that keep your family warm. Small items purchased through small transactions, but essential to the larger project of frontier survival. The general store will be there next month and the month after, as long as enough customers make the journey to keep it profitable. It's your lifeline to the outside world, your proof that civilization exists beyond the trees, your reminder that you're not completely alone in this vast wilderness. The axe in your hands has been in your family for 3 generations. Your grandfather brought it from back east, your father used it to clear the land where you were born, and now you use it daily for tasks that range from splitting firewood to felling trees to everything in between. The handle has been replaced twice, ashwood, carved to fit hands shaped by labour, but the head is original. The iron surface worn smooth by decades of use, the edge still capable of holding a keen bite when properly sharpened. Let's examine the tools that made frontier survival possible. A farmer's toolkit in the 1800s was simultaneously simple and irreplaceable. Each implement represented significant investment, either cash outlay to purchase manufactured goods or time spent crafting items locally, and the loss or breakage of a critical tool could halt work until replacement could be obtained. Tools were cherished, maintained, repaired, passed down through generations, treated with a care that modern consumers of disposable products might find excessive. Here's a historical fact. The American axe evolved distinctively from European predecessors, developing a heavier head, longer handle, and curved bit particularly suited to clearing the dense hardwood forests of North America. The American felling axe became recognized as a superior tool for its intended purpose, and American-made axes eventually commanded premium prices even in European markets. Your grandfather's axe represents this distinctly American tool tradition. The axe serves multiple functions beyond the obvious one of cutting wood. It's a hammer when needed. The flat pole on the head drives stakes, wedges, pegs. It's a rough shaping tool for construction timber. It's a weapon against aggressive animals or, in darker times, aggressive humans. The axe is never far from reach on a working farm, and skill with the axe is one of the first serious capabilities a farm boy develops. But the axe is far from the only essential tool. Let's inventory what a typical farm might possess. Saws, for cutting wood more precisely than axes allow. A crosscut saw for felling larger trees. A bucksaw for cutting firewood to length. A handsaw for construction work. Saws require regular sharpening, a skill in itself, using files of appropriate size and understanding how the teeth should be set. Shovels and spades, for digging of all kinds. The distinction matters. Shovels have curved blades for moving loose material. Spades have flat blades for cutting into earth. Both get used constantly, digging fence posts, excavating cellars, turning garden soil, countless other tasks. Hoes, for cultivating crops, destroying weeds, shaping garden beds. The simple hoe, essentially a blade on a stick, represents one of humanity's oldest agricultural tools, and its basic design hasn't changed because it works. Scythes, for cutting hay and grain. The long curved blade swung in arcing motions can mow an acre of grass or wheat in a day of hard labour. Scythe work looks graceful when done well, but requires skill and stamina to maintain. Here's a quirky detail. The sound of a well-sharpened scythe cutting through grass has a distinctive swish that experienced farmers find satisfying. The blade requires constant attention, sharpening with a whetstone every few minutes during use, occasional peening, hammering the edge thin to maintain proper geometry. A dull scythe becomes torture to use. A sharp one almost seems to cut by itself. Blacksmithing tools, if you're fortunate enough to have basic smithing capabilities, allow repair and fabrication of metal items. A forge, bellows, anvil, hammers, tongs. With these you can shape iron, repair broken implements, craft new tools and hardware. Not every farmer has smithing skills, but those who do are invaluable to their communities. Carpentry tools fill another category. Planes for smoothing wood, chisels for cutting joints, augers for drilling holes, mallets for driving pegs. Constructing furniture, building structures, maintaining everything already built. Carpentry skills matter almost as much as farming skills. The kitchen contains its own toolkit, equally essential to survival. Cast iron cookware dominates, skillets, pots, Dutch ovens, the heavy, durable vessels that conduct heat evenly and last for generations with proper care. Cast iron requires seasoning, building up layers of polymerized oil that create a non-stick surface, and avoiding practices that damage this seasoning. A well-seasoned cast iron skillet is a family treasure. Wooden implements fill the kitchen alongside metal ones: bowls, spoons, paddles, butter molds, cheese presses. Wood doesn't conduct heat like metal, making wooden spoons comfortable for stirring hot liquids. Wood can be carved locally from available materials, reducing dependence on purchased goods. The spinning wheel and a loom, already discussed in our exploration of textile production, represent specialised equipment that not every family possesses. A good spinning wheel, smooth turning, well balanced, comfortable to operate for hours, makes textile work more efficient and less tedious. These tools were often wedding gifts, dowry items, treasures passed from mother to daughter. Historians still argue about whether tool quality or user skill mattered more to frontier productivity. The best tools in unskilled hands accomplished little. Average tools wielded by masters could achieve remarkable results. What seems clear is that both factors contributed, and that the gradual improvement of American tool design throughout the 1800s genuinely expanded what individual farmers could accomplish. Your axe needs sharpening again. The edges dulled from this morning's work splitting firewood, and you settle onto a stump with your whetstone, beginning the meditative process of restoring the blade. The circular motions are automatic after so many years, your hands knowing the angle, the pressure, the rhythm that produces a keen edge. The sound of stone on iron, the smell of metal and water, the gradual transformation from dull to sharp. This is maintenance, the unglamorous work that keeps tools functional and farms productive. When you finish, the axe is ready again, ready for the next job, the next tree, the next generation perhaps. These tools are your partners in survival, extensions of your own hands and will, the physical objects that transform labour into result. Without them, you would be helpless against the demands of frontier life. With them, you're capable of almost anything. The sky has turned a bruised purple-green, and the wind that swept through calm a moment ago now carries the sharp scent of rain and something else, something electric, dangerous. You hurry toward the cabin, shouting for the children to get inside, watching the western horizon where clouds pile into towers that flicker with internal lightning. Weather on the frontier isn't just inconvenience, it's potential catastrophe, and you've learned to read the sky with the attention most modern people reserve for their phones. Let's talk about the elemental forces that shape farm life. Drought arrives slowly, almost politely at first. A week without rain, then 2 weeks, then a month. You watch your crops wilt during midday heat, recover somewhat overnight, wilt again as the relentless sun beats down. The well level drops, imperceptibly at first, then noticeably. The creek that runs through your property shrinks to a trickle, then to disconnected pools, then to dry stones. Animals need water, crops need water, you need water, and the sky remains stubbornly, cruelly clear day after day. Here's a historical fact. The drought cycles that devastated American agriculture during the Dust Bowl of the 1930s had predecessors throughout the 1800s, though less extensively documented. Major droughts struck various regions in the 1820s, 1850s, 1870s, and 1890s, destroying crops and forcing farming families to choose between abandoning their land and watching their investments wither. The difference between survival and failure often came down to water access. Families with deep wells or permanent streams fared better than those dependent on rainfall and shallow groundwater. Floods present the opposite problem, though equally destructive. Rain that falls too fast overwhelms the land's ability to absorb it. Water runs off, collecting in streams that become rivers that overflow their banks, floodwaters that sweep away crops, animals, buildings, sometimes lives. Bottomland along waterways offers the richest soil for farming, but bottomland floods. That's what makes it bottomland. Families who build there accept a bargain: fertility in exchange for periodic catastrophe. Storms bring immediate dramatic danger. The thunderstorm approaching now might produce hail that shreds standing crops in minutes, wiping out months of work. It might produce lightning that ignites fires, kills livestock in the field, occasionally kills people. It might produce winds that flatten fences, peel roofs, topple trees onto cabins. You can do nothing against a storm in progress except shelter and pray. Preparation and recovery are the only options available. Here's a quirky detail. Farmers developed extensive folk methods for predicting weather, observing animal behaviour, cloud formations, wind patterns, and countless other indicators that might signal coming conditions. Red sky at night, sailor's delight; red sky in morning, sailor's warning, encodes actual meteorological information in memorable form. The behaviour of livestock before storms, cattle lying down, horses becoming nervous, provided clues that atmospheric pressure changes were occurring. These observation skills, refined over generations, weren't scientifically grounded but often proved pragmatically useful. Locusts, or more properly grasshoppers in their swarming phase, presented periodic devastation that combined the worst features of drought and storm. Great clouds of insects descended on farming regions, consuming every green thing in their path, stripping fields bare within hours, eating through wooden tool handles and leather harnesses, leaving nothing but devastation. The grasshopper plagues of the 1870s destroyed farms across the Great Plains, driving families into starvation and despair. Nothing could be done against them. They came, they ate, they left. Winter brought its own spectrum of dangers. Cold sufficient to kill livestock caught without shelter. Snow that buried fences, drifted against buildings, made travel impossible for weeks. Ice storms that coated everything in lethal glaze, bringing down branches and power lines later in the century, trapping animals where they stood. The blizzards of 1888, one on the Great Plains in January, one in the northeast in March, killed hundreds and demonstrated that even by century's end, weather could overwhelm human preparation. Historians still argue about whether climate conditions genuinely changed during the 1800s, or whether observers simply became better at documenting extreme events. What seems clear is that American farmers faced significant weather variability that could destroy any year's work regardless of how carefully they had prepared. The frontier saying, "next year, country," the belief that next year would be better, had to be better, reflected this reality. Hope was necessary because despair was always possible. Your storm arrives with full fury, rain hammering the cabin roof, wind shrieking through gaps in the chinking lightning, flashing close enough to leave after images. The children huddle near the fireplace, frightened by the violence outside, reassured by your studied calm that you don't entirely feel. Somewhere out there, your animals shelter in the barn. You hope the barn holds, hope no tree falls on it, hope the creek doesn't rise enough to flood the lower pasture. You can do nothing but hope until the storm passes. After perhaps an hour, the worst moves east, the rain diminishing, the thunder receding to distant grumbles. You step outside to assess damage. A tree down, but not on any structure. Some shingles loosened from the cabin roof. That will need attention before the next rain. The cornfield looks battered but not destroyed. The stalks might recover if given time. The garden has suffered more, tender plants shredded by hail. But even there some might survive. It could have been worse. It can always be worse. The weather watching never ends because weather never stops mattering. You scan the sky habitually now, reading clouds and wind without conscious thought, adjusting your plans based on what the atmosphere seems to be planning. Generations of farmers before you did the same. Generations after you will continue. The sky is unpredictable, unstoppable, capable of giving life or taking it, and all you can do is pay attention and respond as best you can. Tomorrow might bring perfect growing weather, or it might bring another storm, a drought beginning, an early frost. You don't know. You can't know. You just keep working, keep watching, Keep hoping that the elements will be kind enough to let your crops mature and your family survive another year. The fiddle music drifts through the autumn evening, and you're tapping your foot despite the exhaustion that weighs your bones. Old Henderson is playing, his arthritic fingers somehow still nimble on the strings, drawing out tunes that your grandparents danced to, and your grandchildren might dance to as well. This is entertainment on the frontier. Homemade, human-powered, dependent on whatever talents the community happens to possess. And somehow, despite everything, it's enough. Let's explore joy in a world that offered so little of it. Music provided perhaps the most accessible form of entertainment. Instruments varied by what families possessed. Fiddles, harmonicas, banjos, Jews' harps, whatever someone had brought from elsewhere or managed to acquire. No electricity meant no recorded music. Every performance was live, performed by actual people who might be neighbours, relatives, travelling musicians passing through. The songs came from various traditions, old country tunes carried across the Atlantic, African-influenced rhythms filtering up from the south, original American compositions born from frontier experience. Here's a historical fact. The folk songs collected and published later by researchers like John Lomax represent only a fraction of the music that actually circulated in frontier communities. Many songs were never written down, passing orally from singer to singer, gradually evolving with each transmission, eventually disappearing when the last person who knew them died. The musical heritage we've preserved is like the visible portion of an iceberg, impressive but only a hint of what once existed. Dancing accompanied music whenever space and occasion permitted. A barn cleared of equipment could become a dance floor. A large cabin could accommodate a small gathering. The dances were community events. Reels, jigs, squares that required multiple couples moving in coordinated patterns, callers shouting out moves that dancers executed with varying degrees of grace. Young people used dances as opportunities for courtship, supervised by watchful parents, but granted more freedom of interaction than everyday life typically allowed. Here's a quirky detail. Some religious groups prohibited dancing as sinful entertainment, viewing the physical intimacy and worldly pleasure as spiritually dangerous. Families in these traditions might substitute play parties, games with music and coordinated movement that technically weren't dancing, because no one called them that. The distinction seems legalistic to modern ears, but it mattered deeply to people who took religious prohibitions seriously. Storytelling entertained when music wasn't available. Long winter evenings, huddled around the fire, provided natural occasions for narrative. Ghost stories, tall tales, family histories, Bible stories, local legends, news of the wider world transformed into entertainment, the human voice weaving words into pictures that listeners could see in the dancing flames. Good storytellers were valued community resources, sought out for gatherings, remembered long after their deaths. Reading, for those who could read and who had access to books, provided more solitary entertainment. The Bible dominated most households' libraries, read both for religious instruction and for the narratives it contained. Stories of adventure, faith, betrayal, redemption that kept listeners engaged across centuries. Beyond the Bible, whatever books a family possessed might be read and reread until their pages fell apart. Novels, poetry, history, whatever fortune and inclination had provided. Quilting bees combined productive work with social entertainment, particularly for women. The basic principle was simple. Multiple women gathered to work collectively on a quilt, their combined labour finishing in hours what individual work would require days or weeks to complete. But the gathering also provided opportunity for conversation, gossip, relationship building, the kind of social interaction that isolated farm wives desperately needed. The quilts produced were both functional bedding and artistic expressions, with patterns passed down through generations and regional variations that quilt scholars still study. Games entertained children and sometimes adults. Simple toys, carved wooden animals, rag dolls, balls made from stuffed fabric served the youngest. Older children played variations on familiar games: tag, hide and seek, blind man's buff, contests of various kinds. Adults might play cards, if religious scruples permitted, checkers, chess, dominoes, games requiring minimal equipment that could fill evening hours when weather precluded outdoor work. Holidays punctuated the calendar with anticipated celebrations. Christmas was observed with varying degrees of elaboration depending on family tradition and resources. Religious services, special foods, perhaps modest gifts for children. Independence Day brought community gatherings, patriotic speeches, perhaps fireworks or gunfire in celebration. Harvest festivals marked the successful completion of the agricultural year. These occasions provided something to anticipate, something different from the endless routine, something that reminded people that life contained pleasures as well as labours. Historians still argue about whether frontier life was fundamentally grim or whether people found more joy in it than modern observers assume. The truth probably varies enormously by family, by region, by individual temperament. What seems clear is that entertainment, while limited by modern standards, occupied a meaningful place in frontier consciousness, that people sought pleasure, created pleasure, shared pleasure, even in circumstances that might seem to offer little opportunity for it. The fiddle music continues, faster now, a reel that sets feet moving whether their owners intend movement or not. Your daughter is dancing with Henderson's oldest boy, their faces flushed with exertion and something more, the spark of attraction that might in a few years lead to courtship and marriage. Your son has found friends his age and is engaged in some game that produces occasional shouts of triumph or dismay. Your wife sits with other women, talking, laughing, her face animated in ways that daily isolation rarely permits. These gatherings feed something essential in the human spirit, something that requires other people, shared experience, collective joy. The isolation of frontier life is bearable precisely because it's not absolute, because evenings like this punctuate the solitude, remind you that you're part of a community, renew the social bonds that make mutual aid possible. The music ends eventually, as it must. Families load into wagons, begin journeys home through darkness, return to the routine that will resume tomorrow. But something has been added, some reservoir refilled, some capacity for endurance restored. You can work another day, another week, another season. The music helps, the dancing helps, the simple human joy of being together helps. It's not much by modern standards, but it's enough. Spring arrives with mud, endless, sucking, boot-stealing mud that makes every step an effort and every task a negotiation with earth that refuses to cooperate. But spring also arrives with hope, with lengthening days, with the first green shoots pushing through thawing ground. You're about to enter the relentless annual cycle that defines farm life, moving through seasons so distinct they're almost different worlds. Let's walk through a full year on the frontier. Spring begins whenever the ground thaws enough to work. March in warmer regions, April or May in colder ones. The date varying by weather patterns that no almanac can perfectly predict. The first task is assessing winter's damage. Which fences need repair, which buildings need attention, which tools need sharpening before the real work begins. The livestock emerge from winter quarters, thinner than you'd like, eager for the fresh grass that's just beginning to appear. Here's a historical fact. The timing of spring planting carried genuine risk calculation. Plant too early, and a late frost kills seedlings, wasting seed and labour. Plant too late, and crops don't mature before autumn frost arrives. Farmers developed regional knowledge about last frost dates, but these were averages, not guarantees. Every spring brought the gamble of timing, the prayer that weather would cooperate with plans. Ploughing, planting, transplanting, cultivation. The spring months blur into continuous agricultural labour. The corn goes in, hill by hill, followed by beans and squash. The garden gets planted in succession, each vegetable at its optimal time. Animals need attention, livestock breeding time to produce offspring that will mature before winter, chickens setting on eggs that will hatch into this year's flock. The pace is relentless, dawn to dusk, every day that weather permits work. Summer brings the cultivation phase, maintaining what's been planted, fighting the endless battle against weeds, watching crops grow toward harvest. The days are longest now, providing maximum daylight for maximum labour, but the heat makes work more exhausting. Animals need constant water. Crops need rain that may or may not arrive. The garden produces abundantly, providing fresh food after the preserved monotony of winter, but the harvest requires processing before it spoils. Here's a quirky detail. The dog days of summer, the hottest period from mid-July through late August, took their name from the ancient belief that Sirius, the dog star, rising with the sun caused the extreme heat. Farmers observed that this period brought particular challenges. Heat stress to animals and humans, increased disease, crops vulnerable to both drought and sudden storms. Working through dog days required careful pacing to avoid exhaustion and injury. Harvest dominates autumn, the most critical season of the agricultural year. Everything you've worked towards since spring comes to fruition now or fails to. Corn must be picked, dried, shelled, stored. Wheat and oats must be cut, shocked, threshed, winnowed. Gardens yield their final produce, which must be preserved before frost ruins what remains. The labour is urgent because the window is limited. Once hard frost arrives, the harvest season ends regardless of whether you're finished. Livestock slaughter happens as temperatures drop, cold weather providing the natural refrigeration that preservation requires. Pigs that have fattened all summer and fall become salt pork, ham, bacon for the year ahead. Perhaps a steer or heifer becomes beef. Chickens past their laying prime become meat. The butchering is bloody labour-intensive work, but it produces the protein that sustains families through winter. Winter might seem like rest compared to other seasons, but it's rest of a particular kind. Reduced but not eliminated labour. Confinement but not inactivity. The shorter days provide less time for outdoor work anyway, but plenty remains to fill the hours. Equipment repair, tool maintenance, textile production, wood cutting, animal care that continues regardless of weather. Snow days might enforce genuine rest, but clear winter days are working days, just with different tasks than summer demands. Historians still argue about seasonal variations in health, mortality, and general well-being. Winter brought respiratory illnesses, cold injuries, cabin fever from confinement. Summer brought heat exhaustion, agricultural accidents, waterborne diseases that thrived in warm weather. Each season presented characteristic hazards alongside characteristic opportunities, and survival meant navigating them all. The rhythm shapes everything. Social activities cluster in seasons when work permits. Winter gatherings when farm labour is lightest. Community events timed around agricultural schedules. Religious observance fits around planting and harvest. Marriages happen in late autumn or winter when families can spare time for celebration. Babies arrive according to conception timing, but wise parents tried to avoid deliveries during planting or harvest when every hand was needed in the fields. Your body knows the rhythm at a cellular level. Muscles that lie dormant in winter awaken with spring's demands. Endurance that peaks during summer's long days fades as daylight diminishes. Even sleep patterns shift with the seasons. Early rising when summer sun provides morning light. Later rising when winter darkness discourages leaving warm beds. You are synchronized to the agricultural year, the way modern people are synchronized to work weeks and vacation schedules. This synchronization connects you to generations before and generations after. Your grandfather farmed this cycle. Your grandchildren will farm it too, if they stay on the land. The seasons don't care about individual preferences or modern innovations. They simply turn, demanding adaptation from anyone who tries to coax food from the earth. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, planting, tending, harvesting, surviving. The cycle has no beginning and no end. Just continuous repetition. Each year similar to the last but never quite identical. Each year presenting its particular combination of challenges and rewards. You're part of this cycle now, embedded in it, defined by it. The seasons shape your labour, your body, your mind, your relationship with the land and the community, and the larger patterns of existence. This is what it means to be a farmer, to live inside the turning year, responsive to its demands, grateful for its gifts, enduring its trials. The cycle continues. It always continues. The deed lies before you, ink barely dry, your name inscribed as owner of 160 acres in this territory that will someday be a state. Your hands are trembling slightly, from exhaustion, from emotion, from the weight of what this paper represents. You own land. You own land, a thing your grandfather could never have imagined, your father scarcely dared dream, a reality that your labour and luck have somehow combined to produce. Let's explore the powerful dream that drove frontier settlement. The Homestead Act of 1862 crystallised something that had been building for decades. The federal government would essentially give away land to settlers willing to claim and improve it. 160 acres, a quarter section, free to any citizen or intended citizen who filed a claim, built a dwelling and worked the land for 5 years. After completing these requirements, the land became yours absolutely, to keep or sell or pass to your children. The act represented a revolutionary transfer of wealth from public domain to private ownership, and it drew millions of Americans and immigrants westward, seeking their piece of the promise. Here's a historical fact. The Homestead Act, while transformative, wasn't the only mechanism for acquiring land. Earlier, settlers purchased federal land at relatively low prices, often $1.25 per acre. Speculators bought large tracts hoping to resell at profit. Railroads received enormous land grants as incentive for building, which they then sold to settlers along their routes. The patchwork of land distribution methods created complicated patterns of ownership and development that historians still work to untangle. But the dream remained consistent regardless of the mechanism. Own your own land. This aspiration meant different things to different people. For farmers from the crowded, tenant-dominated agriculture of the East Coast and Europe, it meant independence. No more rent. No more landlords, no more labouring on someone else's property. For immigrants fleeing various forms of oppression, it meant opportunity, a chance to build something lasting in a country that rewarded effort rather than birth. For those escaping various forms of failure or scandal, it meant fresh start, a new life in a place where no one knew your history. The process of claiming land required more than just showing up. You needed to locate an available parcel, not already claimed, not unsuitable for agriculture, accessible from roads or waterways that would allow bringing crops to market. You needed to register your claim at the land office, paying fees and navigating bureaucracy. You needed to actually live on and improve the land, meeting requirements that officials might inspect at various points. You needed to defend your claim against challengers from rivals who might dispute your filing or encroach on your boundaries. Here's a quirky detail. Proving up on a homestead, completing the requirements to receive final title, often involved testimony from witnesses who would swear that you had genuinely occupied and improved the land. This requirement created opportunities for fraud, as witnesses might perjure themselves for payment or favour. The land office system struggled to verify claims across vast territories with minimal staff, leading to widespread abuse that enriched speculators and disadvantaged honest settlers. The 5 years of required residence and improvement represented enormous investment of labour and uncertainty. You might work for years building a farm from wilderness, only to have crop failures, illness, or other disasters force you to abandon the claim before proving up, losing everything you'd invested. Statistics suggest that roughly 40% of homestead claims were never successfully completed. The people who started them gave up, died, or moved elsewhere before receiving title. For those who persevered, land ownership changed everything. You could make permanent improvements knowing they'd benefit you and your heirs, not some landlord. You could borrow against land to finance equipment or expansion. You could pass land to your children, establishing your family on the earth for generations. Land ownership represented not just economic security but social status, political voice, and personal identity in a society that associated property with virtue. Historians still argue about whether the Homestead Act ultimately benefited small farmers, or primarily enriched speculators and corporations who gamed the system. The truth encompasses both outcomes. Millions of families did establish genuine homesteads, but enormous amounts of land also ended up in the hands of cattle barons, timber companies, mining interests, and others who exploited legal loopholes. The democratic ideal of the independent yeoman farmer coexisted uneasily with the commercial reality of capital concentration. Your own path to land ownership might have followed the homestead route, or you might have purchased from speculators, inherited from parents, or combined various strategies. Whatever the mechanism, the result is the same. You stand on ground that belongs to you, that your labour has improved, that your family will inherit when you're gone. The feeling is difficult to describe to modern people accustomed to renting apartments and working for wages. This deep connection to specific soil, this knowing that your sweat has literally become part of the landscape. The responsibility weighs alongside the pride. You must pay taxes on this land. Failure means losing it. You must continue improving it, or risk falling behind neighbours whose farms become more productive while yours stagnates. You must navigate the economic uncertainties of markets, weather, health, all the factors that can transform prosperity into poverty within a single bad year. Land ownership is not safety, it's opportunity with risk attached. But the dream endures. Your children see this land as their birthright, the foundation for their own futures. Some will stay and farm alongside you, eventually inheriting parcels that will become their own homesteads. Others will move further west, seeking their own new land in territories not yet settled, continuing the westward pattern that has defined American expansion for generations. The dream passes from generation to generation, adapting but never disappearing. You fold the deed carefully, place it in the strongbox where important documents live, and step outside to survey your domain. Rough still, in many ways, stumps to clear, drainage to improve, fences to build, but yours. Entirely, legally, permanently yours. The dream made real. The frontier absorbed into ownership. The future belonging to whoever has the strength and luck to claim it. The evening light has softened to amber, filtering through the window you finally fitted with real glass last year, casting long shadows across the cabin floor that your children will remember long after you're gone. You sit in the chair that your father made, near the fire that has warmed 3 generations of your family, and you allow yourself a moment of reflection that working hours rarely permit. This life you've built, this farm carved from wilderness, this family raised against odds, this small piece of the continent made productive and home, represents something larger than your individual story. Let's consider what these forgotten families created. The numbers are almost incomprehensible. Between 1800 and 1900, the American population grew from approximately 5 million to 76 million. And much of that growth happened on farms exactly like yours. Small operations where families worked the land with hand tools, raised their own food, built their own structures, made their own clothes, survived or didn't based largely on their own efforts. These weren't celebrities or politicians or anyone whose name entered history books. They were ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply to stay alive. Here's a historical fact. By 1900, roughly 40% of Americans still lived on farms, down from over 90% a century earlier, but still representing tens of millions of people whose lives resembled yours more than they resembled the urban dwellers who increasingly dominated American culture. The transformation from agricultural to industrial society happened within living memory for people at century's end. Their grandparents had lived the life you're living now, and they still remembered the stories. The landscape itself bears witness to their efforts. Forest that once covered the eastern half of the continent is largely gone now, cleared field by field, acre by acre, by people wielding axes and determination. Towns that were clearings in your youth have become cities. Roads that were muddy tracks have become highways. The infrastructure of civilization, so easy to take for granted, was built on the labour of farming families who asked for nothing except the chance to own their own land and improve their own lives. The genetic legacy continues too. Your children, and their children, and generations beyond carry forward whatever biological heritage you've contributed. The disease resistance that let your ancestors survive, the physical capacities that frontier life selected for, the psychological tendencies that helped or hindered adaptation. You're an ancestor now, or will be, part of the continuous chain of human reproduction that connect past to future regardless of whether anyone remembers your name. Here's a quirky detail. Many families kept records of births, deaths, marriages, and significant events in the blank pages of their family Bibles. The one book most families owned, preserved across generations, eventually becoming genealogical treasure troves for descendants researching their ancestry. Your Bible, if you keep such records, connects you to both past and future. Previous generations inscribe before your birth, future generations to be added after your death. The skills you've developed will be largely unnecessary within a few generations. Machines will plough fields that oxen struggle with. Factories will produce clothes that take families months to make by hand. Refrigeration will preserve food without smoking, salting, or drying. The specialized knowledge required to survive on an 1800s farm, how to read weather, when to plant corn, how to preserve meat, which herbs treat which ailments, will fade from common experience as technology replaces necessity. But something else will survive. The ethic of self-reliance, the value placed on hard work, the community bonds formed through mutual aid, the understanding that survival requires effort and cooperation, and luck. These attitudes, shaped by frontier experience, will persist in American culture long after the conditions that created them have disappeared. Historians still argue about how much of contemporary American character derives from frontier experience, but the connection seems undeniable, even if its exact dimensions remain debated. The sun has nearly set now. the last golden light fading to purple dusk, and the sounds of evening surround you. Crickets beginning their chorus, an owl calling from the woods, your animals settling into nighttime quiet. Your family gathers around the hearth, your spouse finishing some mending, your children doing whatever remains of their evening tasks, the youngest already asleep in the corner where a trundle bed waits. This scene, or something very like it, has played out in millions of cabins across this continent, the quiet end of working days that have filled years and decades and generations. You've survived another day, another season, another year. The crops came in well enough this harvest, the animals are healthy, the family is intact more or less, absent those lost to illness and accident whose memories still ache in unguarded moments. The future remains uncertain, it always remains uncertain, but for tonight at least you can rest in the modest security that your labour has provided. The fire crackles softly, the flames dancing patterns that humans have watched since the first spark was struck from stone. The rhythm of your breathing slows as the day's tensions gradually release. The world outside fades to darkness, and the world inside shrinks to this warm circle of firelight, family, home. This is what you've built. This is what it means. This is the legacy that will outlast you, in ways you can measure and ways you cannot imagine. And now, as the fire burns low and the cabin grows quiet, let us ease towards sleep ourselves. The stories of these frontier families, your family in the narrative we've shared, represent millions of untold stories, millions of lives lived with courage and determination in circumstances that would challenge any modern person to survive. The rhythm of their days was hard, yes. The losses they endured were real. The labour demanded everything they had and more. But within that difficulty they found moments of joy, connection, beauty. They danced to fiddle music on autumn evenings. They watched their children take first steps across rough cabin floors. They held hands with their spouses as storms raged outside, and inside there was warmth. Let their strength become your peaceful rest. Let the rhythm of seasons, the turning of years, the endless cycle of planting and harvest lull you toward dreams. The work is done for today. The fire is banked. The door is barred against whatever the night holds. Sleep now as they slept, trusting that tomorrow will bring its own challenges and its own gifts. Sleep with gratitude for the comforts they could not imagine and you possess without thinking. Sleep knowing that the thread of human experience connects their struggles to your rest, their survival to your existence, their forgotten story to the fact that you're here at all, listening, remembering, honouring what they built. Rest well, the morning will come as it always does, but not yet, not yet. Sweet dreams, friend, sweet dreams.